Okay, we are live.
Good afternoon. Today's date is September the 29th. This is the AIB meeting. We're delighted to have with us today our superintendent, Superintendent Chaudhry. We have a number of board members who are board. Why don't we identify those who are here at this time? Rachel?
Sure. We have Vice Chair Kerwin, Dr. Lynch, Dr. Stapleton, Mr. Manko, and Mr. Harris. Dr. Doss is not able to attend today.
Okay. We have a pretty full agenda today. We'll hear from the superintendent. It's scheduled for an hour, but we're going to be a little bit lax in terms of trying to make sure we get the essential component of his presentation in today. We have a working session on Pillar 5 that will follow from that. A discussion on the overall draft comprehensive implementation plan. And I say again, draft, so to make sure that people fully understand that. Then, of course, we will go into executive session for some administrative and other matters to consider, and we will adjourn from the open session prior to doing that. Welcome, Mr. Superintendent. We're delighted that you're with us again. As I indicated in one of our prior meetings, we hope that we'll have you on an ongoing regular basis. Feel free to indicate anytime you think it's necessary for you to come on before that, because as I've indicated before, the success of this AIB implementation plan is really through the board and your work, and we need to make sure that we're working together to ensure that we implement this very, very important plan for the state of Maryland. With that, Mr. Superintendent, I'm going to turn it over to you and your staff. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Chair Leggett, members of the AIB. Rachel, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here today to talk about how, our district's plans become enshrined. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. And I think I saw the message that made me the co-host, so I should be able to start sharing. There we go. And let me go full screen and you guys can see all of that. Yes. All right, great. As required by statute, we submitted draft materials, and I will say draft, like Chair Leggett over and again, so people are aware that these are draft materials for how district plans would get developed, codified, ultimately approved, and then I also want us to think about one step ahead, even though it doesn't seem like we should think about it, is how we would monitor progress annually against the plans that were ultimately approved. And so what we submitted to you essentially seeks to do that. And so this is just a visual image of what we have submitted. These are now public. We had submitted them as confidential drafts, but they're draft, open for feedback and commentary and everything else. Ultimately, you will be approving the criteria for success, and the AIB staff and my team will be working to support our districts in developing strong plans that ultimately come for approval. And that submission date is March of 23. With a June approval. And so these materials are, again, public. And so I'm going to be diving into what we did. We really, this was truly just created from scratch, right? Like we had to think about, but in terms of the concept of writing proposals and rubrics and scoring them, that's not an idea from scratch, right? That there are many things that we benchmark against in the department. And so just like when we did expert review teams, we did the same thing here. So there's an implementation plan guidance document. I call this the instruction manual, right? It's truly just piecing everything together. It helps you navigate the template and how the template was created and what is what and what does this color mean versus that color, and then the criteria for success, and it explains the draft proposed criteria for success and how that correlates to a set of questions or question, and how you use that to rate the level of quality of that question. And then we created something called Blueprint Milestones. These are going to be the things that we believe that we want to look at annually to know whether or not a system is off track, on track, because you can't look at 100 things, but you got to look at the right things. And so we took a stab at that and what that looks like. Of course, all of this, will evolve and refine and tighten in so we can perfect it for our communities. But I just wanted to lay that out there. So I'm going to jump into one of the first elements that we created as part of this experience. It's what we're calling the Blueprint Implementation Plan team. I can tell you, you could say, hey, just districts form your own team and come up with the plan. I prefer not to do that. I prefer to set a floor because what ends up happening is certain voices or stakeholders get left out. So I want you to see this almost as a floor. They can add other members if they want, but at the end of the day, we see these players as essential to just being the writing and planning team and the team that just make sure that none of the pieces fall off the table. And so they'll have different functions, both one engaging different sub communities within their community, working together to draft the plan, attending technical assistance sessions. And so we created, I will just say, a prescribed list of folks that should be on there, right? 3 principals from every level, at least 3 teachers. When I say 3 teachers who are actually connected to the classroom, one of those teachers, we said the association their local association should have a say in picking, and then of course their blueprint coordinator, and then the local superintendent. And then the superintendent can pick, of course, people from his or her leadership team. So one of the first elements of this is you got to have a team who essentially manages everything for you in terms of writing your plan and monitoring progress, engaging the community. I went over the responsibility, so I won't really repeat myself here, but the key thing here to, again, know is that they would not only be responsible for developing the plan and channeling everyone's energy and feedback and everything else, but making sure none of the pieces fall off the table and with their own cadence, figure out how they want to engage their community. So that's one key element of the plan. Engaging the community. It's truly an art and a science. It's not something you can take for granted. As someone who has come into a department that has been said, MSDE needs to engage. I heard that loud and clear coming in. And that's why you see the state board and I really making proactive efforts to engage in a wide variety of ways, as well as expanding the tent and having voices who are usually not at the table. So with that in mind, we also made sure that engagement was truly front and center, that they would have to take their plan. It's very similar to what was required of their ARP-ESSER plans. They had to get public feedback from different stakeholder groups. And so it's the same thing, right? You are transforming your district. You are coming with a plan, a master plan for your district. So you got to show evidence of engagement and not in a, kind of a one and done approach, a continuous two-way dialogue, and also ensuring that historically underserved communities have a say in what impacts them, right? So Blueprint is raising significant dollars for special education students. English language learners, you need to make sure that you have evidence that you have engaged those families and those students with your plan and what you are going to do to transform outcomes for them. These are just the different stakeholder groups. Again, see it as a floor. It is not an exhaustive list, but it is as a floor. We want them to, we purposely call these out so they can have it in their mind front and center, and making sure when they start their engagement work. Now let's dive into the template itself. So you got to have a team, you got to have an engagement plan. And once you form your team and you start mapping out, your meetings and how things are going to look, this is where you would ultimately write out your plan. Again, draft, but this is the template, what we call the implementation plan template. And so just some formatting elements for the public. We had to create a code for, because you have a template, you got to have numbering and things like that. So they're labeled by pillar, section, subsection, and questions for easy reference. So there's a numbering there. They then identified for some key sections the statutory reference that is most salient to that narrative that they're about to write, so they know that that's front and center and where that's coming from. So as they begin to flesh out that plan for that section or for that concept, there is a statutory reference right next to it. And then, of course, there's something called the blueprint milestone for some of the sections for things that we would want to keep annual progress monitoring on. And I'll talk more about that, but these are just formatting elements spread out all throughout the template design itself. The overall philosophy, is one of scaffolding, as I call it. There's the money question, but there's also a set of sub-question leading to that money question, right? And so the questions build up to and support bigger ideas. And we believe, just at the department, because we are in the weeds, we want to support implementation, we want to understand where they're having their struggles, we want to make sure that they're able to flesh out their ideas. Not only that, we also need to make sure that we have the key details, because what I often hear at the department when I hear from a stakeholder and advocate is, what does this look like on the ground? And what I usually have to end up doing is a ad hoc survey to be able to gather those details. I prefer not to do that. I prefer we commit, they're able to flesh out their plans. Obviously, they can revise over time, and we have those key details in place. So overall approach is scaffolding. And then there are different types of questions. There are questions with considerations. So this question basically sets up for them. They have to build a mixed delivery system of pre-K providers and public providers, and families have to be able to access. So the screenshot example I give you is getting at that. But as they respond to their question, here are things you have to consider, right? Based on best practices, when you're building something called a unified enrollment or common enrollment platform or system for families to navigate their choices. And so one of the things that we did is create these questions with consideration. So what they mean is, when you write out your response, make sure you hit upon those things. Not every single thing might apply to your context, but when we go to approve your plan, the criteria for success, we're going to look at whether or not you fully address the question or the set of questions and the things that we basically gave you the trigger for, that we're going to look for as reviewers. So that's questions with considerations. Then we have questions with examples. So for example, this is transition to kindergarten, right? What are you going to do to help students who come from pre-K settings to transition into kindergarten class? Like, what does that look like? What kind of intentional efforts are you going to do? What does that especially look like from private provider to public school system? And so the example is not exhaustive, but it's just to trigger inspiration, to trigger ideas, so they know when they go to write this out, what a good response should look and feel like. And then reviewers also would have an idea as well too. So those are questions with examples. Then we have the types of responses. We have open box, right? So you obviously will type up your response there in the template. We have linked artifacts. So for every response, you can link an artifact. Maybe it's a master bell schedule of a school showing how high quality school day tutoring is embedded during the day. Maybe it's, flex time in high schools for students to be able to be supported in a wide variety of ways. So that's why linked artifacts it's there. Maybe it's a sample day showing how high quality reading instruction is broken up during the day. So we wanted to leave that open. It could be budget, it could be all sorts of artifacts. And then we have a table. Tables are usually data tables where you are projecting out data for multiple years. We did not think of this plan as more than 5 years, minimum of 3, but no more than 5 in terms of setting targets. And so that's laid out for the various pillars throughout the different sections, and of course, broken up by subgroups. Let's now jump to the criteria for success and how we went about doing that. So this is the big thing that the AIB must approve by December, and along with the comprehensive plan. And this is what would essentially be used to approve the plan. And so we took all of that in mind, and knowing all of that, we basically developed a criteria for success, organized by each pillar, right? And it references, right? It corresponds with the questions in the template. Some of the criteria for success may only capture a single question, or because the question is so big and so important that it needs its own criteria for success, versus other criteria for success may cover 3 or 4 multiple questions, or maybe an entire section. So collectively, when you have a response in that section, say you answered those 5 questions, if you answered them well, that criteria for success would capture whether or not that's a quality response. So you're seeing an early childhood image of just a snapshot as an example. Again, each row will receive a rating of meets all criteria, partially meets criteria, or does not meet. At the end of the day, you want to focus on the meets. Meets is what matters. I mean, we're not trying to approve partial plans. We're trying to approve plans that are ready to go. We have 24 school systems in our state. We need to get all of them at where we want them. There's no reason why we should be fleshing out a partial or does not meet by the time plans are approved. And then, of course, there's a column for reviewers' feedback and responses, because we envision that after a rigorous review round, this criteria for success completed by reviewers would go back to LEAs so they can revise their plans, also think of other things that reviewers may have questions for, or as they move on into their journey of implementing the blueprint. Overall, again, LEAs should use the criteria for success for benchmarking their responses, right? A great teacher always reveals their criteria for success or their rubric ahead of, assigning an assignment, so students know what to shoot for. And then to obtain a rating of meets all criteria, generally, right, you have to hit, your responses have to be detailed and specific answers. You might say, what's detailed? Well, it depends on the question, right? If the question already lays out the triggers and things that you have to hit on or cover, then you would know as a reviewer. Of course, we would calibrate reviewers, and I'll talk about that later. And then, of course, responses are presented in a logical sequence, and then the activities and goals are both ambitious and feasible. So that's the criteria for success. And again, so utilizing the criteria for success in approving the plan. Essentially, you would have a set of questions. So I have a set of questions here, A, B, and C. You can see that our focus on student subgroups, this is taken from the pre-K section, because one of the things that LEAs have to do in the early ed section is go into these master MOUs with private providers to better service students who are who have special needs. Those are students with disabilities, students experiencing homelessness, English language learners. So this is that section. So, and the criteria for success is designed based on their holistic response on all of these questions to see whether or not they met that criteria. So this is just an example of how a reviewer would be scoring while they're reviewing plans and such. Obviously, that reviewer would be calibrated well ahead of that session. So just an example here. Yes.
Yeah. This is Britt, a question. So suppose what is your thinking about, say, most boxes are checked yes, a few are partial, and one is no. What would be the consequence of that?
No one gets approved until they get to all yeses. That would be my recommendation to the AIB.
Be sure we were all on this. That was
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No one should be approved until everyone gets the yes. That's what I would hope. All right, let's talk about blueprint milestones. So this is a concept. I think that makes sense. So because ultimately you approve the plans, and then by statute, MSDE are supposed to come to you every year and say, hey, district is off track or on track. And therefore, if they're off track, then here's a consequence, right? And it could be as extreme as withholding funding, or corrective action, implement, etc. And then, of course, a world of support. Well, what are we going to pay attention to? What are we going to pay attention to make sure whether they're off track or on track? And what are those milestones for those pillars? So what we did is we took a stab at creating these off track, on track indicators. So there's 37 milestones embedded throughout the Blueprint Implementation Plan template, spread out across the pillars. And these milestones are both quantitative and qualitative. They ask districts to make multi-year projections and set long-term goals. It could be, right, such as narrowing and closing the achievement gap. It could be getting to 60,000 by 2026. It could be a wide variety of things. And the way I want you to think about some of these milestones is some are timeless, such as narrowing the achievement gap or diversifying the profession. That's going to be an annual journey. And some are time bound, meaning you got to get there by then. And that's what we need to see, such as making sure starting pay is at 60,000. So this would be an early year milestone we want to make sure that they're off track or on track with. So MSDE would, after plans are approved, would use the milestones that are embedded in the template to essentially isolate them for every district and see, right, whether you're off track or on track. And then the public at large has essentially a dashboard to see whether districts are making progress or not, including local communities. You can always download the plan and read everything else, but at the end of the day, they have to execute, right, their plans. They have to execute a high quality career ladder, do all of those things, but all of that should move the needle on these metrics that we want to pay attention to, student learning, etc. And so those are, that's how we went about it. And so, as I said, we had 37. So I'm just going to list them out. Again, I may have missed something or I may have too much, but we took a stab at them. And so these are the milestones. So all of these things have tables and projections that can be objectively looked at. And then the key thing is the districts, as part of their submission, they have to set their blueprint milestones. So we'll let them set their 3-year target for where reading proficiency is going to go for every subgroup and for all students as a whole. So we'll get to see that. We'll get to see, okay, you said you're going to move the needle 5% every year. Okay, are you going to, we'll get to see if they're off track or on track with that. And so all of these milestones are things that we should be able to track, whether someone is off track, on track. And ultimately, it's what I would like to use to tell the AIB, hey, release the funds or tell my team we need to deploy differentiated support here and lean in more because they're struggling here, or there is something going on here, there's a revision needed because they're falling off track or something's not right. So here's an example. These are examples of the milestones that we did. Again, just showing you, obviously CCR has the most because there are so many things that it encompasses. So here's just a look at the CCR blueprint milestones. Again, these all have tables and projections, quantitative and qualitative data targets they set. Here is the continued of college CCR1 or CCR1 and college and career. And then the more resources for students has something related to community partnerships, because the whole idea of a community schools is to set and establish community partnerships. So this one's a funky one a little bit because we're asking them to name out what kinds of partnerships that are going to set and whether they're off track, on track. So, but they can set it and we can see whether they were off track, on track with it. The more resources for schools focuses on more resources for our students who are historically disadvantaged, getting all that per pupil bump. So most of their learning and targets are embedded in the other pillars. That's why I have that note there. If people were wondering why is there not as many milestones in that one? Well, because they're really embedded in the other pillars. So that's blueprint milestones. Let's talk about support. And we really thought very meticulously about this because our districts are going to need a world of support to be able to do this. And so we thought about structuring it workshop style. And so let's jump in. Districts would have different types of workshops. We would work with the AIB to conduct these workshops. We would have them host at different times throughout the week. So we can make sure that they're small groups. And one category of workshops would be just a 101 on the process, right? here's what the template looks like when it's ultimately the final version. Here's the criteria for success. Here are best practices and ideas, and list and learn from one another. We did something similar with Maryland Leads about how you're going to engage your stakeholders. What's the best way to set goals? What is reasonable for what you're going to move the needle on proficiency for students? And then one of the things we embedded in every one of our sections is if they wanted some kind of unique waiver from existing COMAR that is in the way of designing a flexible school design or culture to spur innovation. And so that's there if they want it, if they truly believe something is in the way. And so we would do a 101, just info session on a set of workshops focus on that. Then we would have information sessions by pillar, right? You would have to dive into every pillar and talk about what are the things we're going to look for. And again, you would break them down by separately. You wouldn't do all the pillars in one day. And you would basically bring back the template and the criteria for success for that pillar and have a deep dive conversation about that so people can better understand the expectation on what great answers are going to look like. And they can also learn from their peers. We would facilitate that type of, it wouldn't just be a sit and get, of course. I would not be a teacher if I did that. And so let's make sure they're very dynamic sessions as well. So this is another bucket of information sessions that we would have with our LEAs. And then we would have like very specific topical ones, and we would design them in a way where some are mandatory, you got to all come to this, and some are, what do you think you need the most? Do you need more help in pillar one? Do you need more help in, diversifying the profession? And so we would have topical, more deep dive by different problems of practice. So for example, facilitating effective public and private partnerships for pre-K. That could be a session. Maybe you think you're fine and you don't have to come to that. Or maybe we do require everyone to go to that. For example, developing talent pipelines, hiring for diversity, induction and mentoring, right? The topics, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some things that most likely that will need to be covered. Here are some other examples for pillar 3, right? How do you create high quality job embedded professional development? Blueprint really wants to expand the time that teachers collaborate with one another as part of the career ladder. Well, how do you do that? What are the implications of master scheduling, hiring, any financial implications there? College and career readiness by English arts, math, we would have things like that. Pathways on the CCR and what are problems of practice there. Again, you get the point. The whole point is we would have information sessions on just what is the template, what's the criteria for success, just an overview of each pillar, and then topical problem of practice type. This is where you're going to have like the most hearty conversations. This is where the ideas would be generated and such. So, and then we would have time for them to review, to get feedback on their draft, because we want to give our districts time to write and develop their plans and get feedback both from MSDE as well as the AIB staff to be able to, one, benchmark their answers and ultimately see if they're on a good track to ultimately meeting the criteria. And so we would have feedback sessions for them, and they can share each other's work as well. We did this with Maryland Leads. We could do something similar as well with districts in that session. And then we would have office hours. And so these could be drop-in or scheduled, only get one-on-one time. So if a specific district wanted an hour of time with the AIB and MSD to ask clarifying questions or, have a unique problem that they don't think has been addressed, we can talk about it there. So that's how we would structure support. And so that's support. Now let's talk about timeline. So jumping right in, overall process is there's technical assistance that needs to be provided, right? MSD and AIB will host multiple technical assistant opportunities, and it's very important that we don't shortchange that support for them. If we want to expect the world of them, we got to give them a world of support, as I like to say. Then they submit their plans and they have to be reviewed. So we have to run rigorous review rounds with reviewers, and we will bring reviewers reviewers in, people at the department, coupled with educational experts. They have to be trained, right? And similar to like expert review teams, I may even compensate them for their time. So in order to be able to make sure we get really quality reviewers, and then any revisions that need to be made by districts, we would give them a window of time to revise. And then ultimately, MSD would come to you and say, hey, we believe these plans are ready to be approved. We recommend approval. And then you guys would have to decide whether or not you approve them. And then progress monitoring that comes after that. And then, of course, there could be revisions, right? There could be things that count as like a reasonable revision because something happened out of the district's control that requires them to change a blueprint milestone. So we should allow for a systemic process to do that as well, because things might happen within a 10-year window or a 3-year window that we have to acknowledge. And so that's support. In terms of reviewers, we're thinking 3 to 4 experts who would review each plan. There would be an established protocol for how to review the plans. They would go through calibration training, and we would make sure that it is something that is very robust. It can't be just a one and done here. Just look at a video and you're ready to go to score district's master plans. We have to make sure our reviewers are quite strong, both within the department as well as experts we bring in from the outside. That's why I talked about maybe taking some of the similarities from the expert review team model and using some of those individuals to be able to help support and review the plans. And then again, the reviewers would be expected to give detailed feedback to the LEAs as well. So just in terms of how we're thinking about reviews, I don't have in my mind yet if that's a week-long process. I literally just rent out somewhere like a retreat space and that's where we do, or do we do it all in one day over a 3-day period? But it's not, I don't think it can happen all just in one day. It could be possible in one day, but I would say at least it's a multi-day process.
Mohammed.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, this is Britt. Say a little bit more about who you have in mind as reviewers. You mentioned people from the department, but might they be a teacher and teachers from the schools? Or would you look for people outside of the schools to do the review?
Yeah, Britt, that's a good question. One idea I had was, do we use the expert reviewers we've recruited, since they're technically expert reviewers and they're a mix of district staff as well as professors and other folks who are interested. So that's one version of it. And then the other version I thought is, it can't be anyone part of any district because of potential conflict of interest. Right. And so therefore, we could only bring in people who worked for organizations that have no conflict of interest. And so it could be tough, right? You pick a university person who works closely with that district. I would just have to make sure that they don't review plans in their district or something like that, of course. But that's what I'm thinking in terms of overall. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Moving on. So here's the timeline as it, just the current timeline in terms of how to submit everything. So March is when everything is due. Of course, AIB adopts the criteria for success in the comprehensive plan by December. March is when districts would have to do their plans. And then June is by which AIB needs to approve anything. It could be sooner, but that's the timeline. This timeline that requires everything to be submitted at one point, right? It leaves not a lot of time for workshop support. It just doesn't. I think, we have to get to December for the adoption of the comprehensive plan. We have to get to the adoption of the criteria for success because that's the rubric you're going to judge me by. And then ultimately, we got to kick off workshops, and we would have January and February, and then March is due. So just something to consider there. And then with that in mind, I also submitted for your guys' consideration, and we've already been having conversations with the AIB staff on this, and they have been great conversations, a potential alternative way to accept plans over a multi-part submission that extends the window. It still meets the March submission point, but it changes up what is due in March and what is due later. And so I want to talk about that. So this is just a visual of the current version of if everything was due in March, and then the support. This is an example of how we would have to do workshops. So we would really have to, if we wanted a robust set of workshops like I described, we would have to start workshops like now in the fall. And this would be before even things have been formally adopted in December to really give districts a rich experience. And so with that in mind, I submitted an alternative submission, right, proposal for consideration. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. And so in the backdrop of other things, I know you are well aware, but it's good to just have it all in one place. And this list is not exhaustive. You know, our state test is still being standard set. We won't have results for this spring's MCAT until January of 2023. It's just an odd state of things that we're in because of when Maryland decided to switch tests and never standard set as required by the federal government. We have the CCR study that's coming out in September of 23, which will alter, right, our understanding of what college and career readiness means. And so that will have implications for design. We have regs for teacher prep and we have regs for teacher induction that are on the horizon. And then, you know, this is just a new experience for our school systems. And I'm not even mentioning things like collective bargaining and other things as well. But ultimately, we're asking them to submit a master plan for completely reimagining how their district operates. And so keeping all of that in mind when I give you this alternative proposal for submission. So what I am recommending is a multi-phase submission timeline. And so what that would mean is the first option that I gave you, and then we came up with an option 2 recently. We were talking with Rachel and her team, and we got some feedback. So I'll talk about option 2 after this. But option 1 was LEAs submit some pillars by March, but not all pillars by March. And then by March of 24, they would have submitted their plans for all of the pillars, keeping in mind the CCR the study would come out by then in September of 23, etc. So that's why CCR would be pushed out a little later. So that is one way to do this. So they would only submit a pillar at a time. There would be some overlap in terms of workshops. It would extend the window out for support. And then it would get, and then again, it would allow for focused conversations, one pillar at a time, deep conversations. However, I see some limitations to this idea, which is that every pillar should be thought of in together, right? And so I hear that loud and clear. But this is just a visual of what that would look like. If we did one pillar at a time, you can see that there's a longer window to provide support and then take in each pillar at a time. The other option, this is based on conversations we've had so far, is modify it where some part of every pillar is due in March, but not the whole thing. And so basically by March 15th, that they would submit a little bit of everything. For a lack of better words, that's how I would say, a little bit of everything across the 5 pillars. It would still allow for the extended window. I would even pitch that, and this is based on conversations we've had, instead of March 24, plans would be approved by July of 24. So that allows this school year and next school year essentially to be a multi-part submission and technical assistant and robust workshop experience for our school systems. It also allows you to have interdisciplinary conversations. Now it takes away that limitation of option 1. And so this would have to, the key work for this stream is, and I'll go to the next slide, is the questions I have up. It's which parts matter for the March submission, right? How should it be distributed if we're going to require a little bit of everything and give them a longer runway? I think we can figure it out, but it's that I don't have those answers for you today. I've been thinking about them quite a bit, and my team, and we've been having conversations with your team on this as well. So this is another way to think about it. But regardless of option 1 and 2, what I am asking is we should truly strongly consider a multi-part submission with a longer runway to allow for a thoughtful approach. Yeah, go ahead.
Because I think it's appropriate so that we're not confused. we will have a response once the full board has had an opportunity to review what your staff and yourself and our staff have said and weigh the various options about what our response will be to it.
Yep.
And also so that we will not be confused about this. Secondly, I think that once we make a decision, it needs to be a complete option. In other words, we're not going back and forth between the various options that are out there. We come to an agreement about what it is that we're going to agree on and move forward, not that come close to the deadline, we're debating which
Absolutely.
are options that we're going to go through because the public is confused. So we need to give them sufficient notice, time, and opportunity to know precisely what we're doing. And so that's just my reaction. We have not had a chance to fully address it. We think that there needs to be some adjustment, but we need to come to an agreement first with the board, and then we will respond to that. But once we respond, we hope to have everybody on the same wavelength so that we are not going back and forth about which of the options that we're trying to implement in some fashion.
Absolutely. Can I move forward? I'm almost at the end. And then, one of the things, as I always like to say, is benchmarking our work against just research. And Blueprint is an amazing piece of legislation, absolutely touches every part of our educational experience. So when we created this template experience, this workshop experience, when I'm pitching this multi-part submission with an extended runway, where something's due in March and then some other things are due after that, right? I don't take it lightly. It's based on successful and unsuccessful case studies of educational transformation. One of the ones that we're all familiar with is Race to the Top, right? There was a state competition and a district competition, and it asked districts and state to submit massive plans for billions of dollars to be able to transform teaching and learning, adopt new college and career ready standards, revamp teacher evaluation, etc. All of those things. And that was during the adoption of Common Core era. And those applications were long, and there was lots of criteria for success, and some of them were successful, and they're continuing to refine their work, and some were not. I always like to point to Massachusetts charter school application process. They have one of the most robust, rigorous, and equitable charter sectors in the country. They only authorize them at the state level. They have a cap on how many they authorize, and it is literally a long runway to launch. It's like a 60+ page application just for a single school site. They have interview rounds and many other things. And then when it comes to just language on what success looks like, I also looked internationally, right? England has had the school inspections for a while. I looked into those rubrics with my team and what those tools look like, and they have changed them over time. And so what the language of that looks like, just some examples, but ultimately the key thing is here is phasing in the work does matter. And so does our process allow them to turn in, think along those lines, or are we just expecting them to, write it all out and tell us what you're going to do all in March? So something to think about. MSD's role in implementation plan. I understand that we could talk all day on how long the template has to be, and what details just the general public or the AIB should be focused on, or the state board. But at the end of the day, my team has to be focused on the finer details. And so the template for me matters a lot. The criteria for success matters a lot. The blueprint milestone matters quite a bit more than all of that, because that's off track, on track. But at the end of the day, stakeholders, yourself, the state board, the assembly, the press, the advocates, they are going to depend on the state MSDE, my team, myself, to provide updates, to say, hey, how is this going? Or I would like to see this, or the accountability that is needed behind this, the support that is needed. So I want you to remember that in all of this. And so for that reason, the details of the plan matter as much to me than I would say sometimes more than many others, obviously beyond, in addition to our district. So just every question in the proposed template aids in the districts in truly, fulfilling their responsibilities. We could talk about which question to take out, which one to include, but just that's why there is more detailed and scaffolding involved versus like, hey, why isn't it just a 40-50 page exercise? Please let your stakeholders know to fill out our survey. We have 30,000 Marylanders who have weighed in. We would love to continue. My goal is 100,000. I'd like to get there by the time we release, our plan. And so I really would appreciate you to continue to do that. And with that, any other questions do you have?
Sure, I do. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's been great, illuminating. I have two questions. One of them is, could you talk a little bit about whether you have kind of piloted this idea of this very large template with any of the stakeholders in the districts? Is there buy-in there? And then the second thing I wanted to know is, can you talk a little bit about your milestones and whether some of them that you've selected, are they small enough, are they nuanced enough to show progress? Because there's a lot of milestones that are easy to pick that aren't going to show any movement for 10 years. But we don't want people to lose faith that there are changes happening. So could you talk a little bit about those milestones that you selected?
Yeah, so, in terms of piloting template experiences, the department does that every day through our requirements in Title I, our grant making, our rubrics, our workshops. I mean, this is the world I live in. and my English department has a mini grant. My Title I department has to accept Title I plans. We had to approve ARP-ESSER plans. We monitor ARP-ESSER plans. Like this is, I just launched a major grant initiative my first year called Maryland Leads that required a rigorous experience. So this is all built off of not only that experience, but also, what I have seen since I've spent my first year. And I know I'm confident that the superintendents would appreciate a multi-part submission and would appreciate workshops and supports that allow them to, especially convenings. One of the greatest pieces of feedback I got from Maryland Leads was we really liked being put in a room with each other and being able to break out and talk about what we're doing and how we're doing it. It made our plans to you that much better. And then for me, I liked it is because they were just they were upping each other's game by supporting one another without me having to worry about whether one plan would be stronger or weaker. The other thing that I also learned through Maryland Leads is revision times matter. I hadn't allowed for revisions first when I set out to do it, but some plans were just they were there. And it would break my heart to that's why that conversation with Britt earlier, would you approve a plan that you said no? I said, no, everyone has to get to yes. So it was very important to me with Maryland Leads to get them to yes in some places. So that's how I went about with that. So I would share that. When it comes to the blueprint milestones, let me just go there so I can have them ahead of me. Yes. Okay. So I guess I would ask, when you say, I think all of these things can be tracked. Some of them are smaller nudges over time. Diversifying your profession is gonna take a smaller time to do it. However, we should be seeing progress of a diverse cohort of teachers over an annual on an annual basis. You should be making intentional efforts to do that. Just to say like, hey, you're gonna be like your students, your teachers are going to look like your staff in 5 years. No, that's not going to happen in 5 years. However, we should see forward progress on that. And we should enable districts. They're going to be setting their target, right? We're going to ask them to set their target themselves. So what Anne Arundel says versus Kent might be different for the demographics of their teacher core in comparison to their student core. Ultimately, you guys will have to decide is that rigorous enough? Is that a SMART goal? Is that ambitious enough and yet reachable? And so that is something that both all of us need to decide. But I think all of these things can be measured. It's just measuring them looks different, but we have to find a way to measure them, and we have data to be able to measure them. Some things we might have to come up with something, but ultimately, I think if we don't have something that allows us to do off track, on track, then we will never have a way to have the healthy pressure for accountability and the districts to also keep horizontal pressure on their community and themselves to be able to fulfill the goals of the blueprint. So that's what I would share.
Thank you.
I have another question. You've put forth these thoughts about longer runways. And it's based on the assumption that the AIB strategic implementation plan would be completed in December.
Mm-hmm.
It is as you know from our schedule, we will have a draft plan available in October.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had a very open process in reviewing the various pillars. We've had hundreds of people on Zoom meetings. We've gotten a lot of information.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a pretty safe assumption that the October plan will be pretty near final. Now, when it goes public and other people will have an open hearing and so on and so forth, there could be some massaging of the plan. So I'm wondering if there isn't an opportunity to do some of the kind of workshops that you're talking about based on the draft plan in November and December.
I think the answer is yes, there is. That's why when I had shown you the visual of the single submission, I have the color schemes playing out in October and November as well for workshops. The only thing is we should know what the criteria for success is going to look like, right? Because ultimately, right, the rubric that I'm going to use to ultimately approve your plans, the district should know what they're shooting for. So that's the one that we do need to cement sooner. But yeah, they can. Ultimately, we would be telling district, like, here's a draft. It is most likely going to be like this, but we're going to start doing some introductory workshops, and then we'll go deeper when we get into January, February. We could, that is true. I would still recommend a longer runway, just because it's still not, there's still all these other things that we have to consider related to adoption of regs, the test scores, the CCR standards, and other things as well related to this as well. So. Any other questions? All right. I'm going to stop sharing.
I
Okay,
do
Rachel.
not see any other hands. Mr. Chair, would you like to move on to the next agenda item, or are there other questions?
I was trying to see whether there's some other questions. I had a question. Yeah,
Not letting me go just yet.
early in the presentation, I wrote a note here. So I saw the word where we were looking at things that were in the blueprint, I think, that did not have a particular time associated with it. you said to treat it as an item that was timeless. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, let me, hold on, I gotta reshare here.
That
'cause
word is there?
I know what you're talking about. Let me just readjust right quick so I can all right, I'm just gonna stay on this screen. We were talking about milestones. There we go. It was this slide right here. Yep. Okay, so what I was saying is, as we track progress for districts, there are some things that the blueprint has set as goals that are time bound. And then some are just going to be a timeless quest to try to pull off, right? So being able to get all of our students proficient in reading and narrow opportunity and achievement gaps, that's not going to happen overnight. That's going to be a journey every year to be able to do that, for example. So I would call that a timeless endeavor that we need to track every year. Are more students reading on grade level? Are more students proficient in algebra? Are they off track, on track by subgroup? Those are timeless endeavors. The time-bound endeavors are things like you gotta raise your starting pay to $60,000 by July 1 of 2026. Every district has to go there. That is defined by statute. That's a goal. That's a milestone. So that would be a time-bound one. And as soon as they get to that milestone, boom, we don't track that anymore because if they're already at 60,000. So that's what I meant by that, Chair Leggett.
Okay, let me just react to it just for a second for thought purposes. You may be right that there are some things that we can consider as being timeless. And there may be some things whereby it will take a period of time which we don't know when, at least at this point, when we may get to a level of responsiveness I think it's appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
But of the examples that you've just described, I would not want to use the word or have people assume that that's a timeless goal, as opposed to we have benchmarks or other indices where we can look at to measure where we are in a way that does not suggest a sense of urgency about it. And when we use timeless, it conveys that, well, there's no real time period for us to achieve this. And that, to me, will not go well with assembly and even some in the public on some.
I see what you're saying. If your achievement gap is 40 points, you need to make that 0 points and close the achievement gap. That's not that you got to pull that off in 10 years, 5 years, 3 years, etc. It's not a timeless thing where we will just sit in perpetuity in 40 points. I can see how it gives off that too. I definitely did not mean it like that, but I hear you loud and clear on what you mean.
Or we could have, here are some goals within this time frame we hope to get, and then when
Yes,
it may be, but we have to be sure. So it's on some items the timeless may be okay, but on some we need to put some structure to that. And
absolutely. And throughout the template, just so you know, throughout the template, to ease your mind, there is the targets are set, like, for example, third grade reading, we set it by for the next 5 years. So they would have to meet that forward progress 5 years. And if they don't move forward, then they're off track. And they have to have that sense of urgency. And ultimately, the plans that get approved would show that sense of urgency by how will they move it 10 points up every year, or will they move it a single point up every year? We obviously don't want to see plans that say we're only going to move a single point up every year. So that's how we would craft it. But I hear you loud and clear. That's a good piece of feedback.
okay. Are there any other questions up there, Rachel?
I do not see any.
Okay. All right. Anything else you need to cover with us, Mr. Superintendent?
I do not have to cover anything else. No, I thank you, and I look forward to continuing working with Rachel and her team, and we will look forward to anything else you guys need from us. But thank you so much, and have a great rest of your week and weekend. Thank you.
Before you go, let me thank you again for your work and the presentation. And looking at it, it is just an impressive array of work. I see that you and your staff have put an awful lot of work into some very essential questions. We'll get back to you, but I hope that we can work out through our collaboration with your staff and others an approach forward, that we'll have an approach that we all fully understand, that we plan to implement, that takes into consideration many of the very essential questions and issues that you've raised here. And I think you raised very strong issues for us to consider in terms of how we respond to the very outstanding presentation that you've made. So thank you again for an outstanding presentation.
Thank you so much. I'll see you
Right.
guys. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going back to our agenda, and where are we at this point in time? I think we are scheduled now to go to the Pillar 5. Is that correct, Rachel?
That is correct. The Pillar 5 working session.
Can I ask a question before we get to that point?
Sure.
Do we have a scheduled time to discuss the recommendations that were just made?
Yes.
Okay.
We're not going to, because it will take a considerable period of time, but thank you for mentioning that, but we will set some time aside to discuss our response and also hear from our staff as well and others, so that we were sure about how we want to respond to it. Okay, we're ready to go to Pillar 5?
Yes. This is the last working session of the third round of working sessions that the AIB has been holding throughout the summer. And of course, now we're just beyond summer here with our very last working session. In September, pillars 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 held working sessions in the same format as all the other working sessions, with the public joining in the meeting and sharing their chats and their questions and comments, in real time in the chat box. Unfortunately, we could not hold today's meeting in that same way, but we do still want to have a public engagement and feedback during the session. So we would ask anyone who has a question or comment around Pillar 5, which is governance and accountability, to please send an email to aib@maryland.gov, and we will be monitoring that during the meeting and sharing questions and comments with the board to discuss. And so as a reminder, what we are doing in these final round of working sessions is reviewing the revised implementation graphic to show items that have been incorporated as a result of feedback during the previous working sessions, and also to flesh out more detail around, if it's possible, and it is, more detail around each of the pillars, and in this case, Pillar 5, each of the objectives. And then also to identify ongoing considerations that the AIB will continue to monitor, as well as technical assistance that has emerged that would be helpful in supporting the implementation, both the creation of implementation plans and the actual ongoing implementation of the blueprint. And for today, the Pillar 5 lead from the board is Dr. Stapleton, so she will be facilitating the discussion. And with that, I think we can go to the pillar graphic. Then we'll come back to the slides. Thank you, Emma. I'm gonna put it on somewhere I can see it better. Okay, so just as a refresher for everyone watching, and again, this document is posted on the AIB website. If you go to the meetings tab, all the materials are there. They're also on the General Assembly website. So this is the Pillar 5 implementation graphic, and just a refresher on how to read it. The first item under Pillar 5, governance and accountability, 5.1, that is objective 1. And in this case, it says create, review, and approve implementation plans. To the right of that is a timeline that goes from fiscal 22 to fiscal 32. Fiscal 22 is considered the baseline year, sort of the first, year or partial year of blueprint implementation. And fiscal 32 is the final year of the AIB's existence. The AIB sunsets at the end of June 2032, and so the timeline goes out until then. And then below the objective then are the tasks that support the completing or achieving the objective. So 5.1.1 is the first task, and that is to create the comprehensive implementation plan for the blueprint, subject to periodic updates. And then you can see to the right, there's a star in fiscal 23, which indicates that that date is in the statute, as it is indeed December 1st, 2022, which is fiscal 23. And then periodic updates going out through fiscal 32. And then below that task are a number of what we are calling subtasks. And these are sort of the details or the smaller steps that get you to achieving the task. And so in this case, there are the details around holding working sessions to develop the plan. And you can see below the highlighted row is a row in white, which says AIB solicits feedback from stakeholders in the public on questions and key considerations related to the blueprint implementation. So being in white reflects that this is something that has been added to the graphic since the last version. So anything that has a white background in a full row like that is new. And so this was added to reflect what we have, what the AIB has been doing. And then you can see the yellow dots in fiscal 22 and fiscal 23. So a yellow dot indicates the timeline for when it has happened or should happen, that is not specified in statute. So it's a timeline that either has already happened, or in the future, it's a timeline that the comprehensive plan is setting out as the timeline for when this should be done or accomplished. And so scrolling down, you can see under 5.1.1D is an additional row subtask around what will be in the initial comprehensive plan. And you can see, and this comes, for the most part, these provisions that have been added to the pillar graphic reflect statute. There are some that reflect feedback from the working sessions, and I will identify those, but for the most part, it reflects the statutory requirements. And in this case, it is a statutory requirement that the comprehensive plan include a timeline for implementation of the blueprint with key milestones, as the superintendent was just discussing, to be achieved by each state or local government unit required to implement an element of the blueprint for each year of the implementation period. And again, you can see the star in fiscal 23 because the initial plan is due in fiscal 23. And so moving down to 5.1.2, so the second task under objective 1, you can see in white there is language, and again, this is directly from the statute, that the guidelines that the AIB has to develop, minimum guidelines for the submission of all of the implementation plans, have to include a maximum page length, including appendices. So that was literally written into statute that that the AIB will set a maximum page length for each plan. Just stop me if someone has a question, but I'll just kind of keep rolling. Below
Will
under,
do. And sorry, Rachel, just in case anybody joined late, there is no chat, but you can send an email to aib@maryland.gov and we will answer your question.
yes, thank you. I wish there was a way we could, so I won't even, okay, we'll just keep reminding people. Under 5.1.2E, which refers to the blueprint implementation plans that will be submitted to the board, the requirement in statute is that the first plans be submitted by March 15th, 2023. And below that are rows in white, which have been added, that provide more detail that is in statute around what the implementation plans have to include, or include. And so you can see in the first row below there, it says implementation plan shall be consistent with the comprehensive plan, describe the goals, objectives, and strategies that will be used to improve student achievement and meet the blueprint's recommendations for each segment of the student population. And then below that, I'm not going to read everything to everyone, but a joint plan from MSDE and MEC regarding teacher preparation and training, a plan on Judy centers and Patty centers and coordination, and the CTE committee specifically was specified to be required to submit a plan to the AIB.
We've got a question from Mr. Manko.
So this question is still formulating in my head, but it seems like there would be instances in which the effective authoring of someone's plan would be contingent upon what's going on with another entity. Like aren't there aspects of this where MSD needs to go through and delineate the regulation or kind of suss out some of the details prior to the LEAs going through and articulating what, their plan is going to be contingent upon what, regulations or what recommendations are forwarded by MSD or MHEC. So how do we deal with that when the timelines are all done in unison, but some of the requirements are contingent upon, information or notice from other entities?
That is an excellent question, and right on point. We're going to talk more about this after the working session, but when we talk about the draft comprehensive plan. But exactly to your point, I think that is a very a strong reason why phasing the plans so that everything is not submitted on March 15th is really not only makes sense, but I think it's actually unavoidable because of the sequencing of the different elements of the blueprint don't allow for, to your point, LEAs. Give an example, LEAs are required to provide a plan for their new professional development that is tied to the career ladder. But prior to that, MSDE is required to actually develop a professional development plan that is tied to the career ladder, sort of with what the minimum criteria or guidelines for what that would look like. So we can't ask the LEAs to provide a plan for something that is not, they don't have the information to be able to develop that plan yet. And there are a number of examples like that, both within pillars and across pillars. between the state entities and just things that, there's only so much that so far that an LEA can go. They can't tell us what their career ladder is yet because they haven't negotiated it yet. And so I think that is a really strong argument in favor of some kind of phasing of the initial plan in March. And we have been talking with MSDE staff, and we aren't necessarily all on the same page yet, but we're, at least in the same chapter or book. So, but we do have a little more detail on that when we get to the draft comprehensive plan section of the agenda.
Yeah. I mean, it also seems like at some point in this document, trying to articulate what elements are contingent upon other things being staged prior to would be important for us to kind of outline. But I know that's a lot more work to do. But I think it would be helpful so we know what items are contingent upon other items.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it really, I think in order to determine what phasing makes sense, we need to do that. So we're going to have to do that anyway. We weren't necessarily going to sort of make a list of it, but we might as well, because we're going to have to do. So I think that's really going to be key to figuring out what makes sense to include in the initial plan, the following plan, the plan after that.
Yeah.
Etc.
I would also just emphasize, I think some of this is the importance of the public engagement in this, because, thanks to the help of the public, we have so many different eyes that are now on this document that can go through and surface questions that arise around, various contingencies that exist. So, I guess this is a call out to, our partners that are all watching this meeting that can help us go through and kind of decipher and, help us clarify what makes sense in terms of how, the things that are contingent upon other elements. And clearly your staff is working on this too, but I think the more eyes on this to help us decipher, the better.
And I think we're in a very good position the way, Rachel, that you and your staff have laid out the numbering of the tasks and subtasks, and it's going to be actually quite simple in a way to link those contingencies.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and also just the high value of the public engagement that Rachel, you and your team have been able to lead. So
Thank you. The next, let's see. So I think
Question. Laura, is there a question?
Yeah, sorry, I was reading it to figure out if we should bring it up now, but I'm just going to read it cold here from Shimoya. MSDE's Director of Community Schools role is vacant and mandated by the blueprint. We have 360 plus community schools operating this year with no state level oversight, input, or support as implementation and needs assessment plans are being written. Assuming MSDE is keeping AIB in the loop, what is the plan to fill this required role immediately? Also, why couldn't this pillar meeting be open for direct public input like the others? The answer to that, Shimoya, the last question, is that we had a Zoom bomber at our last meeting. And so that we could not allow that to happen again, unfortunately. But please keep sending questions through the AIB@maryland.gov email, just as Shimoya has done. And I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to answer the first question.
So I am aware that the position is vacant, and I cannot speak for MSDE. I do know that they are in the process of, they're planning to fill it. They are definitely planning to have a director of community schools. As you, Shimoya, point out, it is required by the blueprint. And so that's really all I can say.
Hey, Rachel,
Yes.
even though just in response to Shimoya's good question about public comment, I mean, we might mention that if people do have comment or concerns or questions, what could they do?
Do you mean about
for
pillar
this session-
5?
For this session, since they can't,
Right.
they could
So
email you, they could do
They
it.
can-
You just did.
they can send an email to aib@maryland.gov. And that is what Shamoya did. And that is why we have her question here.
Right.
There we go. Thank you, Emma. So there we go. We're also going to, at the end of the session, we have a feedback form that is available on the AIB website that anyone can fill out any time, day or night, with questions or comments around any of the pillars, actually. So we're going to share that link with everyone again at the end if they don't bring them up during the meeting.
I just wanted first her to be assured that there is a way, despite the limitation at this meeting, and that the limitation is not caused by us, but we're using someone else's website and to launch these meetings. And so until we get our own platform, we have to follow their rules. So
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we could go back to thank you. And I think we've covered the minimum guidelines. So the next one would be under 5.1.3D. There you go. Yep. So you can see an item has been added, a subtask. AIB organizes virtual roundtable sessions for LEAs to discuss challenges associated with implementation. And so this is directly from feedback from the LEAs during the working sessions around asking for more convenings, similar to what the AIB has been doing with the teacher preparation work group. And we absolutely will be doing that, hopefully starting next month. As the vice chair pointed out, even though it will just be a draft plan that will be released in October, there's still opportunities to begin to provide technical assistance and bringing LEAs and experts together to talk about possible paths to successful implementation. The next item has to do with the implementation plans that the LEAs will be submitting to AIB and MSDE in March and subsequently after that. And the details below there are, again, straight out of the statute. So we just wanted to make sure that some of the detail is reflected in the implementation graphics. So some of this is duplicative of what goes in the comprehensive plan, but they have to be aligned with the comprehensive plan. And then there are some very specific things that the statute requires the LEAs to provide in their plan, including how they're going to adapt their curriculum, instruction, and organization of the school day to enable more students to achieve college and career readiness by the end of 10th grade, providing students with the needed services, such as community partnered behavioral health services, and how they're going to identify students who are falling behind and develop a plan to get them back on track. There are other things that I will not read them all to you. But the last one is that implementation plan shall be consistent with the developed guidelines for the submission and approved criteria, as well as concise and focused on measures taken or to be taken to implement and achieve the blueprint's goals. So those are all straight out of the statute. The next items are also straight out of the statute, and this is related to
Rachel, before
Yes.
you get there, I think
Yes.
Mr. Manko has another question.
Sorry to be a pest.
No, please.
What? And maybe this is in a different place, but we have anything in here around like the LEA's responsibility around public engagement and feedback on their plans, or the kind of expectations or responsibilities around that? And where does that exist in the implementation graphic, if at all?
So that is, Emma, correct me if you can think of something, but that's really not addressed in the blueprint itself, but it is an issue that was raised during the working sessions. There are parts of the blueprint do speak to community involvement, like, and stakeholder involvement, like developing the career ladder. There's the option to have a career ladder committee, things like that. But I'm not sure there's much in the law that requires it. However, it's come up as something that should be considered. And Emma, if you want to go back to the slide deck, maybe we'll just show that. And if you go to the next, there we go. So ongoing considerations related to Pillar 5. So one of the some of the feedback involves how state and local entities are engaging stakeholders in developing their implementation plans. So we did not add that to the pillar graphic. We could, if that's something that AIB would like to do. We could add that as a requirement, and certainly the superintendent in his presentation had a lot of suggestions about required stakeholder engagement and committee, who needs to be on local committees and that kind of thing. So we can add to the pillar graphic, but right now we only included it as something to monitor.
And I guess what is the interplay between what we have outlined in the implementation graphic and what the state superintendent kind of expects of the LEA? So, like, I think I tend to agree with him in terms of, like, the kind of setting a minimum composition of a team, and the recommendation for parties that should be engaged and the level of engagement. But I also understand if that's a little bit too in the weeds for what we would, what the legislation outlines and what we would expect within the implementation graphic, just because it's a diverse state and there's different contexts for each of these, jurisdictions. But what's the interplay between those two sets of expectations, what we would outline in the implementation plan and what the superintendent might put forward in terms of what he would like to see from his district?
So another excellent question. Ultimately, there needs to be agreement between the AIB and MSDE on what is required. So so that would be a decision point in terms of what level of stakeholder engagement you would want to require every LEA to abide by, and then we would definitely want to put that in the pillar graphic.
Which actually that leads me to a question of, are we duplicating efforts if we end up just requiring what MSDE is requiring as part of the template? I saw it more as we are laying out kind of the broad end goals, and that MSDE in their template was trying to help the districts get to those places, and went more in the weeds, as Mr. Manko mentioned.
I think it's just a question of if you want to hold them accountable for having done it. So if, it's one thing for MSD to say, here's who should be on your committee to write your plan. But it's another for the AIB to say, if you didn't have a committee with these people on your plan, on, developing your plan, we're not going to approve your plan. So that, to me, that would be the distinction there. But this is sort of the first time we've been confronted with this situation. So, I think that's, again, the chair said, obviously, we're going to have time to talk through these things more specifically.
Well, related to that, Buzzy Heddleman asks a question or a statement and then a question. Unfortunately, Mr. Chowdhury's plan was a plan for a plan that allows each LEA to set its own milestones, progress monitoring, data collection, etc. It's not a comprehensive implementation plan. Why shouldn't AIB require minimum uniform milestones and other provisions like progress monitoring and data collection? This is a huge hole in accountability, and AIB's graphics so far don't require this kind of specific planning. Also, will AIB respond to questions? Yes, we are right now. And I think that we're going to see a little bit more detail that you will like lower down on this graphic. If you want to add anything else, Rachel?
I was just when we discuss the draft comprehensive plan, we do have a set of outcome measures or milestones, whatever we want to call them, to measure progress and monitor around each of the 5 pillars, and then some examples of what those would look like at the task and subtask level. So we definitely will have those as part of the comprehensive plan. So I would just say, stay tuned. We'll get there soon.
All right. So before you're interrupted, Mr. Manko.
So again, this is just laying out more of the requirements of the statute in terms of what AIB has to do under the statute to monitor implementation of the plans and hold entities accountable. And it's sort of all laid out here. So again, I'm not going to read it to you, but I will point out in 5.1.5G, this is the requirement that each county and school system jointly designate a single implementation coordinator. So we call these the blueprint coordinators, and they are each LEA and county has at least one. And the role of the blueprint coordinators is something that has also came up in working sessions in terms of their ensuring that they have access to information so that they can adequately do what they're responsible for, which is really at the local level, really coordinating all of the implementation of the blueprint in that county. So that is on the slide. We won't go back and forth, but that was added to the slide as something to monitor, but was not something that was added to the pillar graphic right at this moment. Excuse me 1 second. I don't want to sneeze.
And while Rachel is
okay, sorry about that.
Go ahead. Sorry, bless you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you though?
No, I was just gonna try to riff and fill some time.
Thank you. Okay, so under 5.2, so this is objective 2 under pillar 5, and this relates to the expert review teams that MSD will be deploying later this year. And you can see some additional tasks and subtasks have been added regarding the expert review teams. So in 5.2.1b, it just lays out what the statute says regarding who will be members of an expert review team. And in below that, you can see language that after the career ladder is well established throughout the state, MSDE will select expert review team members from teachers and principals who are in senior positions on the ladder. And then there below that, and you can see that the it's white across, so there's no identified timeline for that right now. That is because we don't know when the career ladder is going to be well established throughout the state. That is actually something that the AIB is required to determine under the statute. And I know we've added that in further below. We'll get to that, but that's why there's no timeline for that subtask. And then below that in 5.2.2.
Actually, Rachel, before
yes.
we move to that, the next line down was something that was added about the composition of the expert review teams visiting a specific school. I'm not sure what you mean by, or what the team means by type of school being visited. Is that level as in elementary, middle, high, or is that type as in Title I?
Level.
Or community school? Okay, level. So we may want to clarify that.
Okay, we can do that. It could be, I mean, it could be beyond that though. I mean, it could be if it's a Title I school that they have that, someone on the team has that experience, or if it's a community school, you know, that someone on the team has that experience. It could be more, it could be both. But I believe the statute only really refers to the level of the school. Below that, then is under 5.2.2 relates to the plan that MSD submits to AIB with the what schools will be visited and how the teams will be deployed. And again, you can see that there are white rows that are additions. And I will particularly point you to the one that says beginning July 1, 2025, a school that has not been selected may submit a request to be reviewed. So that's sort of interesting. So there's a star there in fiscal 26, and also that AIB can ask that MSD visit a specific school. I apologize. I have a cold that is getting worse. Okay. So if there aren't any more questions around expert review teams, we could move down to 5.4.
Yes, I think we can skip down to 5.4, and this is as a meat of the additions to the subtasks.
Yes, exactly.
I wonder if we take a 5-minute break.
I would really appreciate that.
Let's just take 5 minutes.
And
So,
take 10.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harris, for the suggestion. Again, while we're taking a break, if anyone would like to ask a question who's watching the live stream, feel free to send that to AIB@maryland.gov.
Okay, thank you for the break, everyone. We have some.
Ike had to step off to take a call, so he asked me to take over. And Rachel, I don't know if we're going back to you or to Laura.
I think we can just go right back to Rachel.
Okay.
Okay, so Emma, if we could put the Pillar 5 graphic back up. Perfect. So this is where we left off at 5.4. Monitor blueprint outcomes is the fourth objective under Pillar 5. And previously we had the task that AIB gathers and analyzes disaggregated data to measure progress, implementing the blueprint and achieving expected outcomes. Below that, we have added a number of, there were some subtasks, but not as many. We've added a number of subtasks, and again, those are in white. And for the most part, these are from directly from the statute, but below 5.4.1b, AIB identifies anticipated outcomes and relevant indicators of progress. And this, I think, goes a little bit to Buzzy Heddleman's question earlier, that is required to be part of the AIB's role, and it will be part of the comprehensive plan. We've added that AIB collects data related to teacher satisfaction and school culture. And this was something that was brought up during one of the working sessions, that it's an important measure as part of teachers, really retention of high quality teachers, recruitment and retention of high quality teachers. And we need all of those things in order for the blueprint to be successful.
Hey, Rachel,
Yes.
if I understood Buzzy's question right, it had to do with not having radically different metrics or indicators of success coming from different parts of the state. Is that kind of what he was saying?
Yeah, he asked, why shouldn't AIB require minimal uniform milestones and other provisions?
And it does remind me that one of the criticisms of the Thornton implementation was that it was every district for itself. There was no overarching set of expectations that everybody had to meet. They just developed a plan. And so I think Buzzy's point does speak to that a bit. I just don't know whether you've given that thought or what.
And we have given it thought, and so what we absolutely can do and need to do is set the milestone or target, whatever we want to call it, for full implementation of the blueprint. What are the expected outcomes by full implementation of the blueprint that we will hold the state agencies and entities and the LEAs and other local
LEAs. Okay.
Mhm.
All right.
And then the question is, working backwards from, let's say, year 10 to annual milestone, annual targets, I'm going to call them targets. What is the process to do that? We know where we want to get to. And what we're proposing is that fiscal 22 be the year of baseline data. So for every measure that we're going to use, we would have the starting point and the end point. And the question is, how do we set the intermediate targets? Are they annual? Are they sort of like in 3-year, multi-year kind of bites? And how much input do the LEAs have in setting those targets?
Yeah. Okay.
But just to, if I can amend that,
Mhm.
I
Please.
think that there's still room to allow for differences across districts, depending on how you create or define or operationalize a metric. It could be, for example, if we're talking about teacher diversity, not every district has to have the same percentages of teacher diversity, but perhaps we make the metric the percentage that reflects the student population.
Yes.
So I do think we have to carefully think about these metrics to make sure that they're defined appropriately across all districts. And Joe, you had a question?
Yeah, I mean, my question was also in response to Buzzy's, and I guess I'm going to try to articulate how I'm conceptualizing this and see if this makes any sense. But to me, it seems like ultimately there are statewide goals for these milestones that really the AIB is accountable for. And at least that's how I see it, right? Like we ultimately as the board have these milestones that are set that we're accountable for. And progress on those milestones is an amalgam of all the 24 LEAs, right? So, it seems like we would want to set realistic yet rigorous goals for each of those LEAs in conjunction with those LEAs that cobbled together would help the AIB meet those statewide goals. And there would be kind of expected growth on the variety of metrics, knowing that based on the context of each district, their growth rates may be differential, but as a whole, we would be meeting these goals statewide if everybody is kind of pulling their weight and meeting their intermediate milestone goals that together meet the statewide progress that we're expecting. Does that make sense? Or is that?
It does. If I can just expound there. So, but I do think that, yes, there's definitely room to individualize the targets by LEA. Some will be starting at a different point than others. And so, I think that what their targets will definitely not be the same. But on the other hand, I think for some things, like we want nearly all high school students to graduate college and career ready. It could, that we want that's a uniform goal around the state. That I don't think we would, it depends on how you want to define it, but I would worry if, some of the larger school systems maybe would be contributing a lot of students to that goal, which could potentially allow some of the smaller districts to really not get as close to that goal as we would like for students in that system. So I guess So I guess to reiterate Dr. Stapleton's point, like we have to be really thoughtful about how we do this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, in the college and career ready standard will be the same in every jurisdiction.
That I hope so.
Isn't that a given?
A statewide uniform college and career ready standard, I think would be.
Yeah.
Is what is intended.
And Buzzy has been listening keenly and asks, Rachel mentioned milestones for full implementation. Maybe I missed it, but did Rachel also include periodic milestones between beginning and end? And as to Mr. Manco's point, if I understand it, AIB should be accountable not just for aggregate statewide performance, but for the performance of each LEA.
So Buzzy, I think you did miss it. So I talked about we're going to set the outcome at full implementation. We're going to know the starting point for each LEA and statewide. using fiscal 22 baseline data. And then what the AIB needs to determine is how to identify the milestones or the targets from between here and there, and whether they're annual or multi-year targets, if I'm understanding your question. So in the interest of my voice, I'm definitely not going to read all of these things to you, but please ask questions if you have questions. I'm just gonna, everything under 5.4 that has been added in white, other than collecting data related to teacher satisfaction and school culture, is from the statute.
So,
Until we get down to 5.4.7. So everything above that is all straight from the statute.
can we go back up to where we were when Emma started scrolling down?
So it would be 5.3. 5.4.3, 2, 3.
I think it was actually, where were we? 5.4. Wait,
Yeah,
There
that's
we
what
go.
it was. Yep.
yes, my teacher preparation program colleagues would be upset at me if I did not discuss this item. 5.4.1E. The AIB shall monitor and review the performance of each teacher preparation program at an institution of higher education and alternative teacher preparation program. I've got to ask, what are we monitoring it for? What are we reviewing? Performance with regards to what? Because teacher preparation programs have accrediting bodies that they're responsible to. They have regulations that they're responsible to at MSDE. So what value added is AIB going to be examining here?
I think that's an excellent question. Again, so I think the AIB can review the materials that are already, I don't think there's any intent to duplicate work or effort. And so using information that they're already submitting to MSDE, to MHEC, reviewing the report of the accreditation body, I think those are all important pieces of information that the AIB doesn't have to collect again. I'm just going to think of some examples. Maybe it would be, because in Pillar 2, we talk about wanting the LEAs and the teacher preparation programs to really work together more to kind of create a feedback loop so that they are identifying that, so that the LEAs are letting the teacher prep institutions know about issues or things that would be helpful for them to incorporate into their programs, and then whether that's happening. I'm sure the teacher prep programs have things they would like to share with the LEAs that would help them to better prepare teachers. Maybe obviously they really need to collaborate more around the practicum requirement to be able to implement the new blueprint requirement. So I interpret that as performance relative to the blueprint requirements, the new different things that the blueprint is asking them to do.
So we might want to, if we're having the teacher prep work group meetings, we might want to bring them this language from the legislation and ask them what they think we could, in what way will our review be helpful to them to help them meet the blueprint goals? Or I feel like we need a lot more nuance here as to what we're going to be looking at.
Yeah, we can absolutely do that. I believe the next meeting is on Monday.
Yeah. And these other items below are much more detailed, so you know what you're looking at. You know, the basically number of students who are eligible for free lunch, diversity of school staff, the receipt of concentration of poverty grants.
Yeah, 5.4.1, I think it's I monitor and review the progress of community schools receiving concentration and poverty grants. You know, obviously we'll have to sort of, what is progress? What is progress? So again, that sort of involves setting those target milestones.
Yes.
And then we
Is
can just,
actually, I have not been familiar enough with the Pillar 4 work. Is there a similar sort of work group associated with community schools?
there is not, but so that's one of the topics that we've identified for a convening, and whether we call them work groups or, you know, so we want to do that around career ladders. We want to do that around community schools and use of concentration and poverty funds. Absolutely. And I do see Shamoya has an excellent suggestion. Do you mind reading it, Dr. Stapleton?
Yep, sorry, I was not looking at the chat. Please bring Dr. Toldson back when you create metrics. This is Ivory Toldson, I assume.
Yep.
He's
Yep.
written a book on this and has a perspective that the board needs to be aware of to avoid pitfalls of the past and to be helpful for the public too. Yes, I concur.
So helpful to the commission.
Yes, he was very helpful to
He was
the
awesome. And I think the more we can draw on him, the better.
Thank you for that suggestion, Shamoya.
Joe, you have a question?
Yeah,
comment?
this is maybe jumping ahead to 5.4.2, but we have like a vision on what the mechanism is for kind of tracking the funding and you know, how funds are being disseminated and allocated, and ensuring that the funds are, you know, that 75% of the funds are ending up at the school, and that, you know, the funding, the categorical funding ends up in the category that it is designated for. What is our kind of vision or mechanism for how we're going to be tracking that? And then is there going to be, you know, this is able to be kind of accessed and viewed publicly, or what's the mechanism for this?
More excellent questions. So in 5.4.2D, you can see MSDE in collaboration with the AIB implements a financial management system and student data system capable of tracking and analyzing minimum school funding requirements. And integrating the school system data. So that is part of the blueprint law, specifically and purposefully, so that there is a information system in place that can allow the AIB and MSDE and LEAs to track accurately how they're spending their money, and whether they're meeting the minimum school funding requirement that you refer to, the 75% for most of the formula funding. MSDE has convened a work group that is among the LEAs and AIB and MSDE staff to work on what that looks like. And they've already hired a vendor to start working on it. And that is actually, fingers crossed, a portion of it is intended to be operational by next summer. So now in the meantime, the LEAs are being asked to work on submitting school level expenditure data to MSDE to satisfy a reporting requirement. So where is that, Emma? By January 1st each year, the LEA MSDE is supposed to submit to the AIB. Did you find it? Is supposed to submit. Oh, it's right there, 5.4.2a. There you go. Yeah, so on or before January 1st each year, MSD shall submit information on school level expenditures in the current fiscal year to AIB. So this is a new reporting requirement that actually this will be the first year that the LEAs will provide this information to MSDE so that they can submit it to the AIB. And the intent is that there would be sort of a mid-fiscal year check-in on whether the LEAs are on track to meet the minimum funding requirement, and whether, this is all about, and one of the big I really see changes from the blueprint is while the funding that comes through the funding formulas, the blueprint funding formulas, is essentially unrestricted, they are required to show now through data that the dollars associated with the various funding formulas, so English learners, compensatory education for low-income students as a proxy, special education funds, that those dollars are following those students to their schools. And that is not something that they have been required to do before. And that is sort of a program level budgeting that is not really the norm in education budgets. And so this is a heavy lift for the school systems, but it's really important to being able to gauge whether the dollars are going where the blueprint intends them to go.
Hey, Rachel, on this point, does the blueprint say what happens if the money if that doesn't occur?
So it sort of goes back to the ultimate authority of the AIB to withhold funds from school systems that aren't meeting the blueprint's requirements.
So that would be, that in theory could trigger withholding of funds if school systems were not doing that.
Yes, in theory.
Some sort of penalty. Okay.
Some sort of, yes.
Right.
Yes.
Of course, we wouldn't want to penalize the kids that need the money in the schools. So
Right.
it gets
That is the yin and the yang of it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think were that to happen, I think it would perhaps be
a warning or something.
a warning, right? With the first step being, what's your plan to reallocate resources to meet the minimum funding requirement?
Yeah.
And then show us that you've done that and that it's working.
Well, and I think given that we have budget for technical assistance, we also don't need to just say, what's your plan? We can say,
We can help.
can we help you with your plan?
Yes, absolutely. And I will say, I don't know if you all have heard from LEAs about this. I know that they're very anxious about this new reporting requirement, and because for many of them, they just haven't budgeted this way before. They're concerned about what the data is going to show. And I think we need to view this first report as sort of the baseline, as sort of the check-in, and obviously for LEAs that are not, are very far from the goal, to Dr. Stapleton's point, to really, provide technical assistance and support to help them think through how to reallocate their resources. And then once this new reporting system is in place, hopefully it will not be, because it is a pretty significant amount of work for some of the LEAs to provide this reporting of data in January, by January. But moving forward, this new data system and financial reporting system should make it much less, I'm sure it won't be painless, but much less painful to provide the data to do the reporting. If we want to keep moving, 5.4.3 is the release of funds. So the process here, pretty much everything, we've added all the detail around the process that the statute envisions for the release of funds from LEAs. And so first, let me say, the way the statute lays it out is that for the LEAs, there is a specific amount, which is 25% of new blueprint funds, that is automatically kind of held back in reserve each year. And the AIB determines whether those monies are released to the LEA each year. For the state agencies, the nothing is automatically held back, but the AIB has the authority to have funds withheld from a state agency implementing the blueprint. So it's not the same language, but essentially the process is that, beginning this fiscal year, funds 25% will be withheld. And I think we've talked about this before. For this first year, MSDE is going to withhold all of the 25% from the very last payment of the fiscal year. So that timing wise, the goal is that if LEAs submit plans in March that meet the minimum guidelines that the AIB sets, not plan approval, but the minimum guidelines, and we're going to talk about this a little more in a little while, then the monies would be released, and in time before, basically they would be released before they were ever withheld. So it would be essentially seamless for the LEAs. It would only be if an LEA either doesn't submit a plan or doesn't submit a plan that meets the minimum guidelines that they would be potentially at risk of having funds withheld in fiscal 23. For fiscal 24, the withholding or the release of funds will be based on whether their initial plan is approved or not. So we're going to use the same plan to satisfy whether fiscal 23 dollars are released and then whether fiscal 24 dollars are released. And that will allow us to get sort of on cycle with the procedures that the statute lays out, because the statute is really based on the AIB making a determination before the fiscal year begins about whether those dollars should be released or not. And that was done purposely so that the LEAs had opportunity to, adjust their budgets if need be, if the money really truly was being withheld, at least at the beginning of the fiscal year. And so that is why we kind of need to sort of get on the right cycle with the plans and the release of funds. So then what that means is next fall. So the plans are submitted in March. The determination is made about whether they've met the minimum guidelines and whether the fiscal 23 funds are released. Then we go through the plan approval process through the summer. And by sometime in the fall, decisions are made. I mean, the goal is that before the school year begins, because again, the goal is that the plans are going to, guide the LEAs over the next school year at a minimum moving forward. And so by I think by December 1st, the AIB has to, and that's in 5.4.3F, by December 1st of each year, the AIB has to essentially provide a warning if it's possible that funds for fiscal 24 would be not released. And then a final decision about whether funds should be released for fiscal 24 will be made by February 1st. There's kind of a long runway for that decision. And there also is a requirement for an appeal process. If the AIB does decide to not release funds, the LEAs have an opportunity to appeal. And that's here somewhere, I know.
And where does their appeal go?
Oh, it's in 5.4.3D. Well, excellent question. To the AIB, I think is the way that it is.
So they could,
Another entity is not specified. Let me put it that way.
so they could make the claim that they could clarify or restate or something, and we would look at it again. Is that the assumption?
Yes. Yes. Or perhaps they would sway you with some argument.
Right.
And so I will just say, in order to get on this cycle schedule that the statute envisions, it also envisions that the LEAs would submit their plans in the summer, and then the AIB would review them and make decisions in that, on release of funds in the fall. And so this initial plan would be due March of 2023. Subsequent updates or updated plans, new phases of plans would be due July 1st each year. And the AIB is required to make any changes to the comprehensive plan by August 1st each year. But I think in order to accommodate the LEAs submitting by July 1st, the AIB would need to make any changes to the comprehensive plan in the spring, really, so that the LEAs had enough time to respond to that.
Hey, Rachel,
Yes.
just building off Britt's line of questioning, because I was thinking about this earlier when I saw it, and I was just kind of ruminating about it. It feels to me for 543D, it's not just about establishing a process, but being explicit if we're simply reapplying the criteria, or there's a different set of criteria in an appeals process that would lead us to reverse our decision. And I also think we should probably do that in consultation with critical stakeholders. And I think we should do this well in advance of when we need it. Because this just feels like a recipe for a lot of heartburn. If we're not incredibly thoughtful about it. And it, seems a little odd that we would define our own appeals process. So I think I get it. That's our right to do it, but we should be as consultative as we can, because you want that appeals process to have legitimacy and credibility for people going through it, and for them to understand very plainly, not just the process, but again, how the criteria works in that environment, and how that's distinct, or to the extent it's not distinct from, the criteria as we apply it to make the decision in the first place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And to be very transparent, I mean, to be very
Yeah.
clear about what the expectations are and where you're falling short, if that's what's happening.
Yeah, and I guess to make it really explicit now that I'm saying it out loud, if we're in an appeals environment, are we simply reapplying the criteria and giving folks an opportunity to reassert their facts, and then we're giving it another look? Are we just rerunning the process that led to the initial decision, hopefully with more and better information? Or is there an exception provision in place that would somehow allow us to override criteria? And if so, how does that work? But I don't think this is stuff that we want to make up on an ad hoc basis when we get there. So all obvious stuff, but I was just sitting here thinking about it. And when Britt asked the question, I said to just jump in and voice my thoughts.
Yeah.
No, I think that's really helpful.
Totally agree with Fagan. We need to define the process and the criteria and get public comment on it, and then establish it. It's a very good point.
Actually, I think we would, well, the AIB has the authority to adopt regulations.
Right.
So that might be something that would make sense to put in regulation.
So Rachel, in the interest of time, maybe kind of quickly go through 545 and 546. And then spend a little bit of time on 7, 8, 9, 10, since those are a little innovative.
Yes. So 5.4.5 is the interim evaluation, independent evaluation. So the statute requires 2 independent evaluations of the blueprint implementation and whether it's achieving the expected outcomes. The first, what we call the interim evaluation, is due in December of 2024. So that is not very far off. The second is due in December of 2030. The interim evaluation is, the process to contract with a public or private entity to actually do the independent evaluation as soon as practicable, is what the statute says. And then it lays out some of the things that need to be part of the evaluation. In terms of the in 5.4.d, it's really about what progress has been made towards implementing the blueprint, given that it, even when this date was set in statute, it envisioned that the blueprint would essentially be in full effect in fiscal 21. And so it would have been several years in, but not very many years. But now that we've had the delay that we've had, it's got an even shorter kind of time period to show progress. And then the interim report. So essentially the independent evaluation occurs, it's submitted to the AIB, and then the AIB turns around and provides a report to the governor, the General Assembly, that includes the independent evaluation as well as its recommendations, if any, on changes, legislative or corrections or changes that the AIB believes should be made to the blueprint. And then the final evaluation is more about what has been accomplished and were the outcomes that were expected or intended achieved. And that, again, is due in December of 2030. And that December 2030 report would also include the AIB's recommendation around whether its existence is still necessary to support the implementation of the blueprint, or if it should sunset as it is set in statute to sunset, if there are any recommendations that the AIB would make around sort of structural changes to how state government and even potentially local school systems are organized, that would support the ongoing successful implementation of the blueprint. And then that's that's in 5.4.6, and then 5.4.7 includes you know, the AIB's responsibility to provide outreach and educational materials to the public on the blueprint for Maryland's future. And that has an added subtask that the AIB implement a campaign that creates unique materials for different audiences, parents, teachers, students. That was based on feedback from a working session. And then below that are some provisions that are in the statute. AIB may recommend that MSD and MHEC review the accreditation of a program. AIB has the authority to make grants to innovative programs developed by public schools, higher education institutions, nonprofits, and really anyone that you think furthers the implementation of the blueprint. And then sort of a catch-all, which is that AIB may perform any other duties necessary to carry out the powers granted to it.
So I just have a question on 5.4.8. AIB may recommend that MSDE and MHEC review the accreditation of a program that was found to be ineffective. What programs would fall into this category?
Any program that's accredited. So it could be obviously it could be a teacher preparation program, but it also could be other trying to think of maybe doesn't really, I don't think it would touch on CT. I was trying to think of like potentially community colleges and accredited programs related to certain types of CTE programs. I don't know, that's a very good question.
I'm just wondering what, you know, what would fall under MSDE that would be a program that would be, and I just wonder whether we are in a position or will be in a position to have enough information to ever do that. I don't think that we're in the, or supposed to be in the business of evaluating an entire program. So I just worry a bit about that.
No, I mean, I think the intent, I mean, I think at the time it was referring to teacher preparation programs. But, you know, I think potentially it could be broader than that. And it's authorizing language, it's not requiring language, so it just gives the AIB another potential tool in its toolbox.
Any other questions from board members or audience out there? I'm sorry, I cut you off, Rachel.
No, I was going to say, while we're waiting to see if there are questions, if we can go back to the slides. So I pretty much covered this as we went through the graphic. So these are the items that were specifically added to Pillar 5 graphic based on feedback that was received during the working sessions. The next slide includes feedback that was received that we didn't change anything nothing has been changed in the pillar graphic yet related to these items, but we wanted to bring them to everyone's attention. You know, I think as Mr. Manco asked earlier, should there be something in the pillar graphic around how state agencies and local school systems are engaging with stakeholders? We just talked about this, but the timing of the blueprint interim evaluation is potentially something that may make sense to shift a little bit so that there is more time for progress to be made before the evaluation. And then under 5.4, monitoring blueprint outcomes, there were some specific items, things that were raised that I think are really relevant. They just didn't necessarily make sense to put in the comprehensive plan per se, but we want, you know, to publicly acknowledge them and sort of commit to doing this. And so whether it makes sense to put it in the pillar graphic or just sort of in the plan more broadly in the report. But there was a request that the AIB review all mandated blueprint reports, which of course we would do, but to publicly report any findings or recommendations to ensure the transparency, accessibility, and accuracy of reported data. And this was really referring to self-reported data from LEAs and others. A lot of the data that we're going to use is going to rely on self-reported data, but there has to be a process where you're, ensuring that the data is reliable. To disaggregate data, and I think by race and ethnicity when looking at student achievement outcomes, behavior indicators, and attendance, absolutely. And consider using random sampling to assess student learning outcomes.
Hey, a question on that latter piece. Is this a suggestion to not assess students every year as already done by the state?
Well, that's not an option because it's required by federal law.
Right.
So I think this may be more, well, that's not possible.
Or are there other learning outcomes that are not being assessed that we should look to assess?
I think we could consider this was we're looking at what milestones or outcome measures we're using to look at progress in different areas that aren't specifically related to required federal education assessments. But I think there could be milestones or outcome measures that this could be used for. It can't be used for the kindergarten readiness assessment either, because that's required to be every kindergartner.
Mm-hmm.
Then the last slide related to pillar 5 in this working session is we've done this for each of the pillars to kind of identify technical assistance that has been suggested or that really has if not suggested, it's been apparent by the comments and the questions that technical assistance would be helpful. So we've just got some examples here. And some of this is similar to what Superintendent Chaudhary talked about earlier in terms of technical assistance for the implementation plan. So sessions on each pillar to really make sure any questions that are still out there are have the opportunity to ask, as well as virtual roundtables or convenings with the LEAs, particularly, but also higher ed institutions and whoever else, in certain ones, employee representatives, to really talk to each other. I mean, we have found just with the teacher preparation work group, just there's value just in bringing everyone together in a setting and asking them to share what they're doing and what they think is working and not working. And it's been really valuable, I think, for everyone. And we do have another one of those meetings coming up on Monday. And then below that is targeted assistance in specific areas. And so I think this came up a little while ago. So, these are the really obvious ones. There are probably some less obvious ones that we will think about. But pre-K expansion, the career ladder, CCR pathways, community schools, and strategic budgeting and allocation of resources to the school level. And then, another, I think, really important area would be as the LEAs, particularly, but also MSDE and other entities are starting to think about their plans and strategic planning, the use of data and data analysis to really inform the strategic planning, which is really what this implementation plan is. And so that's it for the Pillar 5 working session, unless we have more questions or comments. And this is the feedback form that anyone can use if they have feedback on Pillar 5 or any other pillar after the meeting. And we've got the link there. Like take a screenshot of it, or also it is right on, if you go to the AIB.maryland.gov website, it is on the carousel right on the front page of the homepage, I should say, of the website.
Okay. There are no additional questions, Rachel?
No,
I do
there's
not see any. Okay.
no.
All right, then what we need is a motion. Thank you very much for your presentation today. We need a motion now to go into executive session. Is there a motion?
Mr. Chair, there is a little bit more in the slide deck.
Yeah, I had to read the statement. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, before we go into closed session.
Oh, I thought and you finished.
Did you want to
Oh, yes. Go back to
We're going to
the
talk about the draft plan a little more. We've covered a good amount of it, so it shouldn't take too long.
wrapped it up there.
Okay.
Okay.
So, so we wanted to talk more about what the Blueprint Comprehensive Implementation is, what's going to be in it. And we've talked at previous meetings that these pillar implementation graphics are going to play a big role in the plan itself, and they absolutely are. But there are other pieces that aren't in the graphics that are very important to the plan and to the process. And so the first bullet there is essentially the pillar graphics, the timelines by pillar for each objective, task, and subtask. We also need to identify the ultimate goals of the blueprint at full implementation and the outcome measures that we're going to use to track progress. So this goes to some of the conversation we just had in the Pillar 5 session. And then, so we'll have the goals and the outcome measures for the overall blueprint at full implementation, meaning year 10. And then sort of how we're going to track that over time, and if you're going to set intermediate targets. And then we also need to identify the expected outcomes and the measures that we'll use to track progress for various pieces of each pillar, by objective, by task, by subtask. It sort of varies depending on the content. And then we're also going to be identifying the key actors or implementers for each piece of the plan, and ultimately we will have a sortable plan, so that if you're an LEA, you could sort on LEA, and you would get a list of everything that is related to what an LEA needs to do in the comprehensive plan. And then we've talked about the guidelines, minimum guidelines for the blueprint implementation plans, and that's going to need to set a maximum page length. The criteria for plan approval, and that is part of what Mr. Chaudhary spoke about earlier, the LEA criteria for success that MSDE has proposed, but also criteria for other plan approvals, which would include MSDE's plan, the CTE committee's plan, and so on. And then building on the work we've been doing in these working sessions, identifying implementation considerations that we really want to keep an eye on, and make sure things are that implementation challenges are being overcome, and the technical assistance to support the plan development, but also just implementation overall. And then lastly, but not on this slide, would be if there are any changes that are recommended to the Governor and General Assembly as a result of this whole process.
Right. Let me go back to the timelines, because what the discussion we had earlier with Superintendent Chaudhary would impact that quite considerably, because that's a big challenge for us, going back and determining whether we want to reevaluate that and make changes, but what those changes would be and how they would fit in with the timelines that have been outlined already. And that may also suggest changes to the legislative mandates that we have related to times as well, and whether or not we seek any potential changes with that as well, correct?
Potentially, I think that the statute provides, gives the AIB flexibility to identify what needs to be, specifically what needs to be in the comprehensive plan, and therefore what needs to be in the plan submitted by the LEAs in March.
To the timelines. So some of that may change as well, would it not?
Emma, can you go to the last slides? This might, I want to see if this is what you're talking about, Mr. Chair.
Bullet 1. No, not pillar 1. In the last slide that you had up.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the first bullet.
The first bullet about the timelines for the tasks and whether we would recommend making any changes to those timelines. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That would require some of that may require legislative changes as well, right?
Is some of it, so Emma, I'm sorry, go back to the other slide, but keep in mind that in the pillar graphic, there are stars where the date is in the statute.
Right.
And then dots where it's not in the statute specifically. So if there's a star and it's not feasible for that to be accomplished by that date, yes, we would definitely need to go back to the Governor and General Assembly.
My point was,
yeah.
Some of the discussion we had with Dr. Chaudhary this morning may impact whether you need legislative changes based on the way I looked at that. Am I wrong with that?
It may. I think that there is we do have some flexibility, but it may. We'll have to it might end up on where it might depend on where you end up.
Yeah, no, but I'm saying based on his recommendation. That's what I'm saying.
Oh. So like delaying pillars, full pillars.
His
with different
but based on his recommendations as I see it now, some of that might require a legislative change. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm correct about that.
Yes, I think some of it could require a legislative change.
Potential recommendation. That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
It seems to me like option 1 would definitely require legislative changes. Option 2, depending on what elements were staged in what particular way, you potentially could avoid legislative changes, but you would have to be very, very careful about how things were staged.
Yeah, but I'm saying my point was based on his recommendation, not on option 2, based on his recommendation. Yeah.
But I think he had both options are, I don't know if they're recommendations, but things that he has forwarded.
Yeah, I understand that. No, let me back up.
Yep.
But for the alteration on that is our suggestion and staff suggestion, if we left the original recommendation, or at least the original plan that he may propose, it would require an adjustment of legislation. Now, what the response may be could be something different. I understand that. I just want to make that point clear.
If I could read a question in the chat from Queen Lafour, this maybe help us talk about next steps. Thank you for all your transparency throughout this process and for Superintendent Chaudhry's presentation earlier this afternoon. All have been very helpful. I just wanted to ensure I understood some of the next steps, and I think this will be helpful for us to make sure we understand the next steps. The AIB will review the draft plan presented by the superintendent and add or subtract to it before it's released again publicly mid-October. Will this review process occur in executive session or via a public working session? Thanks. So I think we need to clarify our plan versus MSDE's plan.
Well, if the question is whether that would be something for public discussion, ultimately, yes, because it'd have to be in the ultimate draft plan that we have. Are they talking about discussion prior to that point, or once we made a recommendation?
Well, so it says the AIB will review the draft plan presented by Superintendent Chaudhry.
Right.
And then add or subtract to it before it's released again publicly in mid-October. See, that's where I think we've got a confusion between the MSDE template and then our own AIB plan. So that is what is being, the AIB draft plan is being released in mid-October. Hold
one second, that long. That certain piece will certainly be for, that plan will be open for public discussion. It will be available publicly.
Right, the AIB comprehensive plan.
Yeah.
Right. And so when Queen referred to the review process, will this review process occur in executive session or public working session? Will our review of the MSDE plan and the template be in executive session or public working session?
I see, yeah. It may be some parts of it may be an executive session, but I think some of it may be public discussion based on the meeting dates that we have, because both plans or both points are out there publicly already, what the superintendent has suggested and what our staff is working on. But I'm not sure that there will be public discussion of what the staff is in fact doing, because that's essentially what they're asking at that point in time.
Yeah, if I could, so I think if the the process would be that staff will review, and we have been reviewing MSDE's proposal, and will come back to the board with findings, thoughts, recommendations, options, and that the discussion of those things will take place in public.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But not the staff discussions.
Correct.
At level, if that's what they're asking.
Correct. Exactly.
But board discussions would have to be in public.
Absolutely would be in public.
Right.
Yes.
Any other questions, Laura?
I don't see any.
Okay. All right, thanks. I think you had a question earlier about the legislation and what may be required in terms of changes.
Right. So I think Mr. Manco, as he said, option one, which was MSD's original proposal, certainly we would need to look very closely at whether that's something that could be done without changing the statute.
And it will be difficult because if we follow his first proposal, then in March, we would only look at several of the pillars and not others. And the legislature would still be in session, whether they would, I mean, so you'd have to get, if we were going to go that route, and we had to change the dates through the legislature, I don't see how that happens, because you'd have to get the legislature and the governor to act in March.
Before March 15th. Yeah.
Before March 15th. And you know their schedules, Rachel. Is that likely?
It would be very challenging. It would be very challenging, but I think, as the superintendent said earlier, that he himself recognized that perhaps it was not ideal to separate them out by pillar in that way, and that it would, while it will be a little more challenging for us to work it out and figure it out, that it might make more sense to make sure that the initial plan and every plan that is submitted, covers all of the pillars and all of the blueprint in some form or fashion. And so maybe if we can skip ahead to, Emma, if you can go back to that timeline slide. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you, without making everyone dizzy with the pages.
Are there anything else we need to
Well,
cover?
yeah, while we're waiting for that, Rachel, Shamoya asked if there's details about that. Is it November 10? Is there a public hearing?
November 10 is the date for the public hearing. We are still finalizing the time. We're trying to hold a portion of it sort of during the day and then a portion of it in the evening, so that folks who aren't able to participate during the workday have an opportunity to participate. It will definitely be virtual. People will definitely be able to join virtually, because we want to hear from folks around the state. Whether there is also an in-person option is still also something that we have not finalized. But Thursday, November 10th will be the public hearing. So I wanted to show this slide as to kind of give you a visual for this is sort of a, we'll call it a riff on option 2 that the superintendent shared earlier. So this would be what that could look like, with a little, playing out a little further. So there would be essentially the initial plan, blueprint plan for the LEAs would be submitted in 2 phases. Phase 1 would be the March 15th, 2023 date that we've been talking about. And then phase 2 would be the following July.
What do you mean by the following July?
So July of 2024.
So over a year.
Yes, because in order to get the timeline or the schedule for when plans are due and reviewed and all that to line up with the statute, the plans would, we could have them still come earlier, but it might make more sense to give them a little more time, because when the commission was developing the schedule, the thought was that the LEAs would have more time to focus on their plans and finalizing their plans, towards the end of the school year and when school was out. But that's something that date is not in statute. So that is something that the AIB can determine when the plans would be due. The only date in statute is March 15th, 2023.
So if you broke up the pillars this way, wouldn't that change the state appropriation in support of the blueprint? Because there would be things that wouldn't be being done.
If I think what you're saying is that the LEAs are receiving funding
Yes.
to support, all pieces of the blueprint, and
Right.
I agree. I think that the intent, legislative intent was certainly to have a plan that at a minimum sort of provided some information and plan around how the dollars that they're receiving and have already received to implement the blueprint are being used. Absolutely.
Seems like to me it gets very messy.
So this is sort of, so there would be an initial plan that would have sort of two phases, two submission dates. And what we would do is we would identify the things that that the LEAs are able to respond to in March, that they would have the information and the time to respond to it. So to go back to Mr. Manco's point earlier, there are things that simply sequentially the LEAs don't have the information that they need to be able to provide a plan for how their new professional development system is going to support the career ladder, for example, because MSDE has to develop a new professional development system first. And so what we would be proposing is to essentially identify the sequencing of things, and so the items that could be done that would affect the next 2 to 3 years would be in the phase 1 of the plan. Phase 2 of the initial plan would essentially cover everything else that could be covered, and we would do that same process. So then they would submit sort of what we're calling an updated plan, which wouldn't necessarily, they're allowed to submit an update every year, so they have that option. They will certainly need to submit progress data every year to support whether the intended expected outcomes are being achieved. So we would need progress data every year, and what we would need to get directly from the LEAs and what we'll be able to collect from other sources, so that we're not, reinventing the wheel. We'll sort that out, but there would likely be some kind of submission every year around progress. But they also would have the opportunity to update things. But then we would be asking for, sort of a full refresh or a full update in July of 25 and again in July of 28. And this is just one possible timeline for submissions.
Mhm.
Are you going to show us, before I ask my question, are you going to show us other options?
No, that's the only one we have for you today.
Okay. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I'd like to go back to what Dr. Kerwin was saying. I guess one of the things that I'm just interested in is, the blueprint is not new anymore. It feels new to us, but the funding for the blueprint has been flowing now for some time, and the actual legislation has been available for some time. So what is the process by which we merge these things together in terms of identifying that there are data points that may not be available, there are things that may be changing that need a little bit more time and a little bit more development, but also understanding that school systems are currently receiving funding to do these things, and that they're sort of how are they utilizing the existing funding in terms of moving towards whatever it is that they are moving towards. And is that something that then is part of the implementation plan, really? Or is that just a separate, does that come in sort of a fiscal reporting document separately?
I feel like it's both. I think that what MSDE staff and AIB staff need to do is go through and identify exactly what you said. And those are things that absolutely need to be in LEA plans and, in using Mr. Chartery's template, they need to be in the template to make sure that we're going to get that information from the LEAs as part of their initial plan. And then I think the question about how they're using their funds, in some ways it ties to the template in terms of like, for example, pre-K funding, so they're getting a certain amount of additional pre-K funding based on their enrollment, but part of the question is, how are they utilizing those resources that they're getting to support pre-K to build it out so that they're going to be able to enroll more students in the next year and the year after that. So they're kind of tied together, but then separately, we can look at how they're using their funds, and hopefully the various reporting that they're already required to do under the blueprint will give us most, if not all, of what we need to do that.
We have two questions in the chat that's about kind of procedures over the next month. So I'm going to read them both and then you can clarify. Buzzy asked, will staff's recommended additions to the draft comprehensive implementation plan graphics, so those white rows, be available and publicly discussed before October 13th? That's question number one. And question number two is from Christina Miller. Will the AIB take written feedback from the stakeholders outside of the November 10th public hearing on the draft plans?
We will take written comments from anyone.
And anytime.
At any time.
Can we put up back that graphic that has the bit.ly thing?
The bit.ly, yes, and yes, we can, and I'll ask staff to do that. But we are going to actually create once the draft plan is released, we're going to create, because the feedback form is very much tied to the work we were doing in the working session. So we're going to create a feedback form that is more tied to the draft plan and the draft criteria for success. So there will be a new feedback form that will be available once the draft plan is released. But in the meantime, that other feedback form is absolutely, it's open all the time. And the new feedback form will be available 24/7. And we will compile all of the comments that we get and share them with the board members and the public, as we've been doing.
All right. And then Buzzy had asked, are we going to be are the new additions, the new white rows, going to be available before the October 13th meeting?
So we have posted already. So the version, like this version of Pillar 5 is already available publicly with the changes. So if any further revisions or changes that will be made to any of those graphics, we will be posting them next week on the AIB's website.
I guess I interpreted Buzzy's question to be around like the milestones and things like that. That I think you said were also going to be included within the comprehensive implementation plan. What is the plan for, I guess, making those publicly available and getting feedback on that? But I don't know. I don't know if that's what Buzzy was talking about, but
I'm not sure. If he's literally talking about the graphics, we did commit to posting those updated versions, and we will do that next week. And you'll be able to tell on the website under if you go to implementation plans for each pillar, you can tell when material is posted. We put the date, and there should be something for each pillar new next week.
I think I agree with Joe. I think
But if
Buzzy was asking about elements of our comprehensive implementation plan. I think it would be hard for us to make a commitment to making that public before the release of the draft, because I suspect staff is going to be working, could well be working to the deadline on that release, and to sort of dribble out stuff before the draft is complete. Rachel, I would worry about making a commitment to do that.
Yeah, I agree with Britt. That would be potentially a real challenge for us, and I would much rather get something for which we responded to as a body, allow the staff to do its work, and then put out for discussion what we are looking at, so that everyone can have an opportunity to look at it comprehensively. Otherwise, you will get precisely what Britt has suggested, and it will have a negative impact if you only get pieces of it. You will not know how it fits into the overall plan. We need to allow the staff. Usually happens in situations like this. The staff will do its work, provide recommendations for which we will act publicly on, and the public will have an opportunity at that point in time to give its feedback on it.
I see you nodding, Rachel. You agree?
Yes, yes, I don't see, given the time available, how it could be done any sooner publicly than the 13th of October at the next board meeting. So the other thing that we have for you today, and you have it also in writing, so sort of, and the public has it, are outcome, the blueprint goals and outcome measures for the overall blueprint, and then for the pillars, and some examples of some other outcome measures. And so just sort of the big picture, part of the AIB's requirements in law is to, and then, well, we reviewed what the law requires. What the AIB is going to do as part of the implementation graphics that we've already been working through is to, there you go, monitor implementation of the various tasks on the implementation graphics, and whether those tasks are leading to the intended outcomes of the pillar, because that's really the ultimate goal. All those tasks are just supporting the objectives, and the objectives are supporting what we're trying to achieve under the pillar, and all of those pillars are supporting the overall goal of the blueprint. And so that's sort of the scaffolding that we're thinking about in terms of monitoring and accountability. And so as we did this work, we thought about some of what the underlying principles that will really apply to all of the outcome measures that are used. And so we tried to kind of summarize those as the first bullet there is data will be disaggregated in every way that is appropriate by student subgroup, which absolutely includes race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, the language, if a different language is spoken primarily in the home, students with disabilities, and gender, and possibly other there could be other appropriate student groups for certain data sets. And we'll do this, whenever it's appropriate, which is nearly all of the time, and to the degree that is possible with the data sets that we have. And then the second bullet is to collect and analyze, data comprehensively. I will say again, we will use the data that is available and already being reported as much as possible, because I think we want to minimize the amount of direct data that the AIB is undertaking to collect, particularly because shorter life, the AIB has a 10-year charge, and data collection, that is ongoing data collection, that's a real commitment. And then that outcomes will be tracked through a combination of quantitative data and measures and qualitative data. So there's not a quantitative data measure for every piece of the blueprint, and in many cases there's really good qualitative data. And I see Dr. Lynch has her hand up.
I'm just wondering about the data collection. How transparent will the data be to the public? So the data that we collect, will the public be able to look at any piece of data that has been presented to us?
So we have to abide by privacy rules, student privacy rules. But we can certainly, for a lot of this data, we're going to need it at a pretty granular level. So we're going to need to sort of think through what sort of data the public can have access to sort of at the student level, but certainly aggregated up a level or two, it should be possible, but perhaps not all of the data. Dr. Stapleton, you're much more of an expert on data than I am.
I was just going to say, if we're using the Maryland Longitudinal Data System data for any of these, they have a set of criteria for suppression review that we would need to follow. Like no cell sizes less than 10,
Right.
No percentages that could lead to figuring out cell sizes are less than 10. So we would follow those, but also those data should be FOIA-able.
Mhm.
So I think that we are obligated to present that information. And I also wanted to just clarify under language and under the second big bullet, first little bullet, language of the home is likely not available, but whether a student has a status of English language learner would be available.
Yes, that is true. It's not what the statute says, but that is true. All right. So then this is a first, it's not the first draft actually, but this is the first public draft of from the staff of the overall goal of the blueprint, the expected outcome of the blueprint when it's fully implemented. And so you can see nearly all Maryland students, regardless of zip code, income, race, ethnicity, gender, language spoken, special needs, or any other unique characteristic, everybody leaves high school globally competitive and prepared for success in post-secondary education, work, and life. And then below that are some potential outcome measures that the AIB would use to evaluate whether the outcome is being achieved. And so many of these, in fact, I think all of these are really, so year 10 is full blueprint implementation, at least on paper. So by year 10, a rise in the rate of students entering kindergarten who successfully graduate on time and move on to post-secondary education or well-paying jobs. So this is sort of a cohort rate, looking at each entering class of kindergarten using fiscal 22 as our baseline and tracking them over time to see. And here you can see we say rise in rate of students and reduction of gaps among student subgroups. So that is sort of that's the measure, but what the actual target is still to be determined. So what are we going to actually?
So you're distinguishing between a measure and a target.
Well, so the measure is looking at this cohort rate. Yes, I guess I am. Yes. So the measure is
I was
using
going
this.
to raise a question about just saying rise in rate, because what,
Mhm.
what if it was 1%?
Right.
That's no good. So you're thinking there'll be a refinement of that with an actual, some sort of quantitative, okay.
Yep. And so in order to do that, we would start with baseline data. So
Right.
what is it in fiscal 22? And then, what is, if again, if our expected outcome is that nearly all students successfully graduate on time and move on to post-secondary education, what are we looking, what rate is that we're going to call success? Is it 85? Is it 90? Is it 95%? Whatever it is. And then potentially setting interim targets along the way, or milestones, whatever word you want to use.
Rachel,
Mm-hmm.
one thing that seems a bit of a disconnect here is you say nearly all Maryland students, regardless of where they live, graduate. And then you say nearly all students graduate CCR. I'm not sure what that means, but by year 10. Now, certainly the commission made a sharp distinction between the percentage of students who were CCR by 10 and those who actually graduated from high school, college, and career ready. But the way the language reads here, it sounds like maybe it's the same expectation.
So CCR is college and career ready.
Right.
And so what we have there in the second bullet is focusing, since this is just the overall goal, the big picture goal. What do we want to see at the full implementation? We want all students to graduate high school CCR. Nearly
Right.
all. Not
Right.
all, but nearly all.
Yeah.
As we move through this, and we have, so this is the overall blueprint goal. We also have goals or expected outcomes for each pillar.
Right.
And the CCR by the end of 10th grade is a measure.
Absolutely. I'm just, my only point is you're using nearly all for high school graduation and for achieving CCR by year. And those will be different.
So this one is that nearly all students graduate from high school CCR.
Right. With CCR. So that, let's say 80%, 85, 90.
Yes. Right.
The fraction of students who do CCR by year 10 will be a lower percentage.
By 10th grade, right.
10th grade.
Exactly.
So, but you're using the same language and you say nearly all in both categories.
Oh, in pillar 3, have you looked ahead?
No, I'm just looking at this. You say nearly all Maryland students will graduate high school. And then you say nearly all students will complete CCR by year 10.
No, we say up above it says we'll leave high school globally competitive and prepared for success.
Well,
so that is basically words
okay.
for CCR. Is that what you mean?
Well, I'm assuming that the graduation prepared for success means you've reached the CCR standard.
Yes.
Okay.
So
we'll talk offline. I don't want to hold everybody up.
But just to be, so the expected outcome is sort of in words. What are we expecting? And then either quantitative in data, whether it be quantitative or qualitative data, what measures are we going to look at to determine whether
right.
we
I'm not getting my point across. We'll talk offline.
Yeah.
All right.
Rachel, we're going to come back to all of this. We just need what the general highlights are, and we'll have in-depth discussion, point by point, issue by issue, of any point that people need to make. We need to just note the general outline, hold up questions if need be to later, so we can go through that deep other to go through each of their points.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Dr. Lynch has her hand up.
Sure.
I want to be respectful of the chair, that I think we can come back to this, but as I'm looking at it, if we're doing cohort based, by year 10, students will only be in 9th grade if they've entered kindergarten. We won't be seeing sort of those full results by then. So I think we've got some work to do to think about what we're measuring and how we're measuring. And I think I'm feeling a little bit, I think I understand that there's a difference between what we expect by 10th grade, which we've changed in the language, and year 10, which is in the 10th year of implementation. And I think that's was originally causing me a little bit of confusion, but I do want to just sort of highlight that in 10 years, if the idea is that we're making movements starting with that expanded pre-K, we're going to have to do some real cohort modeling around who was in those expanded pre-K programs, how far, we aren't going to see the full impacts of the blueprint in 10 years. And one of the things that I'm always cautious about in evaluating data is when we abandon something too quickly because we haven't given it the opportunity to really be fully implemented. And in year 10, it won't be fully implemented yet because children entering pre-K today or next year will only be in 8th grade by year 10.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And so my bad for not pointing out that it does not say by year 10 at the end of that first bullet, because it will take more years for a cohort to, But
Thank you, Jennifer. You cleared up my confusion. I thought you're talking about 10th grade, by the end of the 10th grade. So that's why I was confused.
Okay.
Apologies.
That's okay. Well, we need to make it not confusing. So that's the overall, that's the blueprint goal. And these are our first attempt at laying out some outcome measures to monitor whether we're achieving the goal.
Well, I'm sure it'll be wordsmith, but just for feedback's sake, I think it's a great start.
Thank you. It's a first, yes.
Right. No, I'm sure we'll want to change some things, but it's at least gotten us off and running.
So then we've done this basically for each pillar now. So if we move to pillar 1, we've got the expected outcome of, essentially, what are we trying to accomplish within early childhood education to support the blueprint goal? And so here we've sort of boiled it down to nearly all students enter kindergarten ready to learn, and all that means in terms of ready to learn. And then the outcome measures, which are really guided by the objectives and the tasks that are below, are we would want to see the kindergarten readiness assessment results improve over time. And by year 10, almost all students demonstrate kindergarten readiness when they come to school. Gaps in readiness between student subgroups decrease over time and are nearly eliminated. And then gaps in readiness between providers decrease over time. And again, some of these may be too ambitious. They require more, they require setting actual, decrease over time is pretty general. That's a trend you'd want to see. But again, what is the actual target that we would want to see? And then we've also done for each pillar. So we've got the overall expected outcome and the measures we're going to use for the pillar. And then we're going to need to drill down further into the objective task subtask level. And so we have an example of what that could look like for each pillar. And you can go to the next slide. So the first objective in pillar 1 is to expand publicly funded full day pre-K. And again, just to reiterate, so that objective is supporting our overall goal of pillar 1, which is that nearly all students come to kindergarten ready to learn. So we want to expand full day pre-K because we think this is one of the key ways to achieve that goal. And so then the outcome measures that we could look at to see whether that's being accomplished would include, the number of 3 and 4-year-olds from low-income families enrolled increases, so that by fiscal 26, and this is a requirement in the blueprint, all low-income 4-year-olds who wish to enroll are able to do so. So that one's a little more specific because we have something in the statute that is guiding us. The next one is the percentage of public and private providers meeting high quality standards increases annually until sufficient providers are available to support all low-income 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds who wish to enroll. So basically, until we have a supply that meets the demand. And then lastly, participation of childcare providers and staff in the various financial supports and incentive programs that the state is funding increases annually. So we're not going to have the second bullet. We're not going to have a sufficient supply if we're not if childcare providers and staff and existing pre-K staff who need to upskill are not doing that and not being supported by the public programs that the blueprint funds in order to do that. So that's just an example of one set of possible outcome measures. And so then we've done this basically for every pillar. And I see Mr. Mancro has his hand up, and we also have a question from Buzzy.
So first off, I think what you've done is fantastic. I think it's really smart how it has been devised. I guess my one comment would be to, now that the MSD has included their milestones, just making sure that we're reflecting on those and making sure that there's synergies between the two, and that we're using that to kind of inform the milestones that are being created here. And then the question would be, math is not my strong suit, but assuming that there are more or less three milestones for each of the subtasks, and each pillar has about 5 subtasks, right? We're really talking about 15 milestones for each of the pillars. So I guess just taking that all into account, at what point, and it's more just kind of a global question about like, what is the sweet spot of like really measuring this with the level of depth that we need, but also not getting to the point where there are so many different data points that we have focused on, that it really waters down the ones that are the most critically important for us to pay attention to. And I don't know what that kind of sweet spot is, what that exact number is. I would say, in general, the number, when you look at it in totality, seems pretty high, but I guess we also need to think about this as it's a comprehensive piece of legislation, and there are many people, certain groups that are focused, really, really intensely on certain aspects. So I think maybe even going through and trying to delineate this per owner, right? How many of these are really, the responsibility and the needs the deep tracking of MSDE versus the LEAs versus MHEC would probably behoove us, just so that we make sure that there's not entities that are overwhelmed with so many different metrics that they're tracking, so as none of the metrics become that important.
Yeah, I think that's right on. And that's why we only gave examples, because I think we really, and the board needs to really think deeply and thoughtfully about what gets measured gets done generally. And so if you measure everything, I mean, obviously we want everything to get done, but it's probably not realistic. So, thinking about it through that lens and what are truly the measures that really, capture enough of what you want to see happening to be the right measures. And some of them are really more basic kind of data monitoring of output measures rather than outcomes. Like the number of pre-K slots is sort of more of an output measure than an outcome, although it's sort of both. Buzzy is asking, what is year one? And I will say that in what we're proposing, how we're thinking about it, fiscal 23, this current school year is year one. So then moving on to pillar two. Pillar two is a very vast pillar. It encompasses a lot. So the expected outcome is not as boiled down as pillar one. But so you can see that Maryland has a high quality teacher and school leader workforce that approximates the diversity of Maryland students statewide and by district, is sufficient to fill all needed positions and roles across the state, and provides teachers with professional learning opportunities to improve student outcomes and additional responsibility, authority, status, and compensation as they gain expertise. So that's sort of a mouthful. And then some of the outcome measures that we thought about that could be used to measure whether we're accomplishing that. So looking at both the candidates and graduates of teacher preparation programs, and whether through enrollment and then graduation, they increasingly reflect the diversity of students in the state. And insufficient supply to meet Maryland's workforce needs and meet the new graduation standards. And then looking again at teacher preparation graduates, so that's just looking at the teacher preparation inputs and outputs, and then looking at incoming teachers really, and whether by subgroup and across the various programs, whether they're being licensed at an increasingly high rate, recognizing that as the requirements become more rigorous, we might see a drop first and then an increase. And again, by year 10, nearly all graduates meet the standards and earn licensure. The third one is a supply of highly qualified and diverse teachers increasingly meets the demand by district, statewide, and within high need schools. And I would also say subject matter, and that again, there are sufficient supply of high quality and diverse teachers to fill the new roles that are available in schools under the career ladder. The next one looks at the retention rate of teachers and leaders. Retention is key to if you recruit great teachers and leaders, we want to hold on to them. And if we're not, then that's definitely a sign that something's not working. And then finally, that LEAs establish well-functioning career ladders that, do all the things the career ladder is intended to do. And then here's an example of an outcome measures for objective 2.4, which relates to the career ladder and professional development system linked to the career ladder. And the first one's pretty basic, the number of national board certified teachers across LEAs and subgroups increasing until we have sufficient supply. And again, the number of teachers at each level and tier of the career ladder increases until there's a sufficient supply. Pillar 3, college and career readiness. So this, the expected outcome is a CCR standard that reflects readiness for post-secondary education and training. And that Maryland has an education system, instructional system designed to ensure that nearly all students who enter school ready to learn can reach the CCR standard by 10th grade and then participate in post-CCR programs that are high quality in our pathways, our 3 pathways. And then we have a lot of proposed outcome measures here. College and career readiness is a little easier. It lends itself more to quantitative data. So I'm not going to read these all to you, but essentially the first one is about that students are getting the support they need before 3rd grade so that they are hitting our 3rd grade milestone of being on track for CCR by the end of 3rd grade. Obviously looking at student achievement outcomes at all of the intervals of assessments for all students and by subgroups, and looking at gaps between subgroups and all students. The 9th grade tracker. Again, high school graduation rates increase and gaps are reduced among subgroups. Fewer students are assigned to special education so that by full implementation, there is a decline in special education enrollment, and the commission and the numbers were modeled on actually a 50% reduction in students who are have an IEP or a 504 plan. And this is really focused on students who are at the less intensive end of the continuum of special education needs. So the idea is if we do these interventions early and we help catch kids before they get too far off track and get an IEP, then they'll stay on track and they won't go into the special education count. We'll just leave it at that. And then we've got a couple of measures around CCR and CCR pathways. So it's a lot, to Mr. Manco's point. It's like what do we really, and that's just at the pillar level. That's not even trying, going down more granularly. So if we go to the next slide with our example, implementing CCR pathways. So we really focused on the number of apprenticeships and high quality CTE programs or career and technical education programs being offered until there's a sufficient supply to meet workforce demand. And the number of students enrolled in post-CCR pathways increases annually as more students become CCR by the end of 10th grade. That's a more sort of obvious one. Moving on to pillar 4. More resources for students to be successful. And so here the intended outcome or expected outcome is that students who are living in poverty or concentrated poverty are English learners and who receive special education services receive all the resources and services that they need to be successful, and by year 10 are reaching college and career readiness at the same rate as other students. That's a big one. And then that all students receive supports to address behavioral health needs. And you can see the metrics or the measures are focused on reducing achievement gaps, implementation of the community school model, and looking at again, the hiring and retention rate of high quality teachers in concentration of poverty schools, student discipline rates, school safety, health metrics, all of those things. And then we have similar measures for English learners and special education students, and looking at behavioral health needs being met through the coordinated community supports that the new consortium will be managing. And then the example here is next slide. Enhancing student health services, which is under Pillar 4. And so here we're looking at the number of school-based health centers in schools with high poverty rates. And this is something that is actually in the consortium's statute, that the number of behavioral health providers increases until all students can access services in a timely manner within 1 hour of their home. And then last but not least is Pillar 5. More simple. The blueprint is fully implemented with fidelity and successful in achieving the blueprint's goals. And again, we've really covered all of this today. And the example, next slide, would be around blueprint outcomes for that objective. Again, collecting and analyzing disaggregated data and keeping the public informed, releasing funds based on whether plans are being implemented, and analyzing LEA expenditures to determine if blueprint funds are being used as intended. So these are have a slightly different approach than some of the others. Pillar 5 is a little more challenging. So that was what we wanted to share with you. And then around just some of what partly what Superintendent Chaudhary talked about earlier around blueprint implementation plans. Of course, he was only talking about the LEA blueprint plan implementation plans. MSDE and other state agencies will also need to submit plans to the AIB. And so we just kind of laid out some of the guiding principles around what would be expected in the blueprint implementation plans, that they should be aligned with the comprehensive plan, that they should be actionable and concise, that they should cover all the pillars that are applicable to that entity. Some will not go outside one pillar, but many will. And recognizing that the timing is sequential, both within pillars and across pillars. And so sort of to that phasing idea again, that, we're going to need to be adjusting what we're looking for in the plans and then the outcomes as the different pieces are being implemented sequentially. And then the timeline that we already showed you. And that's it.
Rachel, real quick, what have we heard from the CTE committee? And there was some confusion about whether they'd fully created their board, and
The CTE committee is fully appointed, and they're in the process of staffing up, and they are holding their first meeting. I think it's next week. Someone, please.
I think it would be important for us to hear, as we've heard from Chaudhary, it would be important for us to hear from their director at a fairly recent and fairly soon. So
Yes, that is actually, at least tentatively was, something we were gonna do at the October meeting.
good.
But we may need to, we think we're gonna have a full plate at the October meeting, but yes, now that they have a chair and they're fully, not fully up and running, but actually functioning, yes, we absolutely will do that.
And we'll be an observer at their meeting. I see they're meeting the 10-4.
Yeah, it's next week. Yes, we'll definitely be, and I think I'm speaking to them.
Good,
Making
great.
some introductory comments. I know I am. I don't think I am. I know I am. Yes, it is October 4th at 2:00.
Well, a lot of work has gone into this, and it's certainly from my perspective, a very good start.
Okay.
It's a start. It's a lot.
There are additional questions that we need to go through at this point? Okay, any other comments? If not, again, thank you, Rachel. It's a lot of work, as I said earlier, in a relatively short period of time. And hopefully we'll be able to meet all of our deadlines and times and get public engagement on all that we're doing. Just to remind you again that we'll be doing some internal work with staff. We'll make some presentations to the full board that will be discussed at a later meeting, for which we will have public input from any and everybody who would like to give their opinions about the recommended blueprint, or at least the draft of the plan at that point in time. Okay, are there no additional questions or comments? We'll then entertain a motion for executive session. Would you read the comment for the public and for the record, Rachel?
Yes. So the motion would be to adjourn to executive session in accordance with the Maryland Open Meetings Act to discuss items related to administrative function.
Okay. All right. Is there a motion to
Move.
all right, been moved? Is there a second to the motion?
A second.
The move and second, we go into the executive session. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
I
Aye.
Any objections? No dissents? Okay, the motion carries. We're going to stay on this. Go on another. Send us another.
You received another link for the closed session.
Okay, let me see. Make sure I've got it.
Yep.
where did it come from?
All
It
right.
came from the AIB email address.
All right.
The same email where the Zoom link was, right below it is the closed
Thanks.
session link. Graham, can you drop it in the chat for everyone?
For the chat,
There you go. It's in the chat.
should it be in
Thanks,
the chat?
Rachel.
Are we the only ones in the chat?
The public cannot.